The rain started early that evening, the kind of relentless, bone-soaking rain that makes the world feel distant and closed off. It wasn't a storm forecasted on the weather app I checked before heading out, but once it began, it quickly turned from a drizzle into a downpour, so thick it masked the city's usual noise with a steady, deafening patter against the office windows. I was alone at work in a mid-century office tower downtown, a place that had seen better days. The building was aging, and while it had been renovated in parts, the older sections still held on to the kind of atmosphere only decades of history could create. The scent of musty carpet, faint traces of smoke from years ago, and a feeling that the walls themselves had absorbed countless secrets. The 11th floor where I worked was mostly empty after the last few employees left, around 6 p.m., and I had been tasked with finishing some last-minute reports before the morning. At first, the solitude was welcome. The rain cast a silver haze over the streets below, the lights outside streaking in blurred lines. The hum of the overhead fluorescent lights and the click of my keyboard were the only sounds that kept the silence at bay. I told myself I enjoyed the quiet, a break from the usual hectic office chatter, even if it was tinged with a strange edge. It was just past 9 p.m. when the lights flickered. The ceiling's buzz dimmed and brightened erratically, casting long shadows across the room. I glanced at the breaker box by the door. The storm must be messing with the power. The emergency lights kicked on, bathing the space in an eerie red glow. I sighed and leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. Suddenly, I heard it. A soft tapping, like footsteps coming from the hall outside my office. The hallway was long and narrow, with walls painted a dull beige that seemed to swallow sound. I stopped typing and listened intently. The tapping wasn't regular, but irregular, slow and deliberate, like someone walking cautiously. But that didn't make sense. The building was supposed to be empty, except for me. I got up, heart pounding lightly, and opened my office door. The hallway stretched into darkness. The building's main lights were out, and the emergency reds cast unsettling shadows. I stepped out, the tapping continuing ahead, then fading away. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. Just the rain hammering the windows on the other side of the building and the hum of the emergency lights. I took a few steps toward the elevator lobby, but the elevator wasn't there. The doors were shut, but the indicator light was off. I frowned. Maybe the power outage had disabled it. Then, from the far end of the hallway, a faint silhouette appeared. A man, standing still. He was drenched as if caught outside in the rain, his coat heavy and dark, water dripping from the brim of a hat. His posture was stiff, almost unnatural. I blinked, and he was gone. My breath caught in my throat. The building suddenly felt colder, the warmth I'd been enjoying vanishing like mist. I hurried back into my office and locked the door behind me. The phone rang. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. No one was supposed to be calling at this hour. I grabbed the receiver. Static. Then a low, raspy voice whispered, "Help me." The line went dead. I dropped the receiver and pressed the speakerphone button, but nothing happened. The emergency lights flickered again, and the air in the room grew frigid. My breath became visible, little clouds of vapor in the dim red light. I saw him again, the figure standing just beyond the glass window of my office, eyes sunken and pleading. "Who are you?" I whispered, fear clawing at my voice. He didn't answer. He simply raised a trembling hand as if reaching for me. Then he vanished. For the next hour, I sat frozen, every shadow and every creak setting my nerves on edge. My phone was dead, the internet was down, and the storm outside showed no signs of letting up. The emergency generator's dull thrum was the only noise besides the rain. I wanted to leave, but the elevator was still offline. I considered the stairs, but even that felt like stepping into the unknown. The thought of walking the dark hallways alone in that cold building where I'd seen something I couldn't explain paralyzed me. Eventually, the lights flickered back to normal. The warmth slowly returned, and the figure was gone for good. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I asked around about the building's history and the older sections in particular. An older security guard told me about a man who had died there decades ago, a maintenance worker who had been caught in a similar storm. The power failed, and he was trapped in the basement until help arrived too late. People said he sometimes roamed the halls during storms, trying to warn, or maybe just seeking escape. I never worked late on rainy nights again. Story the end. The rain hadn't let up since early afternoon. By 6, it had turned into one of those bone-soaking downpours that made everything look like it was melting outside the windows. I sat alone at the front desk of the dental office, chin resting on one hand, the other slowly flipping through the end-of-day reports. The waiting room was silent except for the dull tick of the wall clock and the patter of rain against the glass. Everyone else had already gone home. Keller had left at 5 sharp. The hygienists had trickled out one by one, umbrellas and ponchos trailing behind them like capes. I had offered to stay and finish the books, partly because I needed the hours, partly because I didn't want to go back to my empty apartment and face the silence there. It was easier here, in the soft fluorescent light, with the buzz of the computer fan and the quiet hum of air conditioning masking the loneliness. Around 7, the power flickered. It was brief, just long enough to make the lights buzz and dim and the computer screen blink once before everything returned to normal. I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, listening. There was something odd about the moment the power wavered, like the building itself had sucked in a breath and held it. I got up, walked to the front door, and peered outside. The streetlights were still on, and cars crawled through the wet intersection across the street. The storm was loud now, sheets of rain pelting the sidewalk, thunder rumbling distantly every few minutes. The world looked far away, sealed off by glass and water. As I turned back toward the front desk, I thought I heard something. Soft footsteps, maybe. They seemed to come from the hallway that led to the examination rooms. I froze, straining my ears. The office was closed, the doors were locked, and everyone had left. I was certain of it. Still, I called out, "Hello?" just in case someone had returned. No answer. I waited, heart beating faster now, and then walked slowly down the hallway, flipping on the light switch as I went. The hallway brightened, revealing closed exam room doors on either side. Nothing looked out of place. I checked each room, one by one. Empty chairs, sanitized counters, unused tools neatly arranged on trays. In the last room, one of the dental chairs was reclined all the way back, the light above it tilted downward as if mid-procedure. I was almost positive it hadn't been like that earlier, but maybe someone forgot to reset it before they left. I reached out and tilted the chair upright, then switched off the overhead light. As I turned to leave, the light in the hallway clicked off. Just like that. Total darkness. I stood still, my breath catching in my throat. I reached for the switch and flicked it up and down, but nothing happened. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The narrow beam cast long shadows on the walls, stretching toward me like fingers. Back at the front desk, the lights were still on. The darkness seemed to be confined to the back half of the office. I was heading there when I heard it again. Footsteps, but not walking. More like a shuffle, as if someone was dragging their feet. They were close. I turned toward the hallway, shining the light down it. Empty. "Is someone here?" I asked, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. There was no response. Just the rain outside and the low hum of something electrical, maybe the backup power supply in the computer. I waited, listening, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was nerves. Maybe a draft. Maybe pipes. These old buildings made weird noises, but I felt something else in that hallway, like the air had changed. It was cold now, and the smell had shifted from antiseptic to something older, damp, like mildew, like clothes that had sat too long in a forgotten drawer. I returned to the desk and sat down, trying to steady my hands. The computer screen was dark. I moved the mouse, tapped a few keys, nothing. I checked the plug, the power strip, everything. The outlets were dead. Then I heard the sound of the sterilizer beeping. It was coming from the lab room at the end of the hall. The machine should have been off, but the sound was unmistakable. Beep, beep, beep. I didn't want to go back down there. My body felt rooted to the chair, but my curiosity, or something deeper, pushed me to stand. I moved slowly, phone flashlight cutting across the walls. When I reached the lab, I found the sterilizer lit up, the digital display blinking. But the screen was scrambled. The numbers and letters made no sense, just gibberish, like the machine was malfunctioning. I leaned closer to get a better look. The lights in the lab flickered, and I saw something reflected in the steel of the sterilizer. A shape, vague, dark, standing just behind me. I spun around. Nothing there. The air in the room felt dense, as if it had weight. I backed out, my pulse hammering in my ears. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard a soft, wet breathing, gasping, irregular. It came from one of the exam rooms, the second one on the left. I crept forward, heart in my throat. The door was open just a crack. I pushed it wider. The chair in the center of the room was reclined again. The light above it was on, and there was someone in the chair. At first, I thought it was a patient, maybe someone who had come in late, but the figure didn't move. It lay perfectly still, a thin hospital gown draped over it. I couldn't see a face, just the top of a pale head and one dangling arm. "Hello?" I said, stepping inside. The figure didn't react. I moved closer, my flashlight beam shaking in my hand. When I got near the chair, the figure vanished. Not like it got up and walked out. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. The chair was empty again. I backed away, bumping into the tray table, knocking instruments to the floor with a loud clang. I ran from the room, through the hallway, back to the front desk, and then every light in the office went out, pitch black. My phone flashlight flickered, then died. I stood in the dark, barely breathing, the sound of the rain now seeming impossibly loud. And then I heard a voice, a whisper, right behind me. "You're not supposed to be here." I turned sharply, but I couldn't see anything. Another whisper, closer. "Go now." I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't care about the storm, didn't care that the door was supposed to be locked. I yanked it open, the lock disengaged without resistance, and ran into the downpour. I didn't stop until I was across the street. I turned back and looked through the glass windows of the office. Someone was standing behind the front desk. They didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, half shadowed by the dim security lights, watching me. I didn't go back the next day. I quit over the phone, said I had family matters, couldn't continue. I never told them what I saw. But a few weeks later, I got a text from Amanda, one of the hygienists. She said the new front desk girl had also quit after only 3 days. Said she kept hearing someone breathing in the lab, seeing things move out of the corner of her eye. Amanda sent it as a joke, half laughing. I didn't laugh. Story the end. The rain started softly in the late afternoon, just a few drops tapping against the office windows. By the time I arrived for my late shift, it had escalated into a steady downpour, the kind of rain that clings to your skin and seeps into the bones. The sky was a heavy, slate gray, and the streetlights flickered to life behind the glass. Outside, the city was slick and shimmering, but inside the building, everything was quiet, sterile, and cold. I worked as a night auditor at a small, independently owned hotel downtown. It wasn't fancy, more of a no-frills place for travelers and business people needing a room for a few hours or a quiet overnight stay. The front desk was tucked into a corner of the lobby, backed by tall windows that looked out onto the street. My job was simple: check guests in and out, answer phones, keep records, and occasionally clean up if needed. Most nights were uneventful, but on this particular evening, the storm seemed to bring something else with it, something that didn't belong. The building itself was old. Built in the 1920s, it had the creaks and groans of a place that had seen better days. The wooden floors warped over time, the paint peeled in places near the ceiling, and the flickering fluorescent bulbs hummed softly overhead. The lobby was dimly lit, a few plants drooping in the corners, the worn carpet threadbare in spots. The rain drummed against the windows in an unrelenting rhythm. I was the only one scheduled to work after 10 p.m., so by the time the clock ticked past 9, the lobby was empty, except for me. The evening check-ins had slowed to a trickle, and the front desk phone's ringing was sporadic and mostly from room service or the occasional inquiry. I sat at the desk, scanning through the computer, updating records, when the power flickered. The lights dimmed for a second and then steadied. Outside, the rain intensified, pounding harder against the glass. A sudden chill swept through the room. I pulled my cardigan tighter around me and rubbed my arms. The heat was supposed to be on, but the cold was unmistakable. The first sign that something was off came as a faint tapping noise somewhere behind the front desk. It was soft, irregular, like the patter of fingernails on wood or glass. I turned to look, but no one was there. The staff area behind me was empty, no housekeeping, no maintenance. Shrugging it off as the storm playing tricks, I went back to my work. Minutes later, the phone rang sharply. I picked up the receiver expecting a guest or a room service request. "This is the front desk," I said. Silence. Then a low breath, like a whisper, barely audible. Then the line went dead. I frowned and checked the caller ID. No number, just unknown. The phone sat silent for a few seconds, then rang again. This time, when I answered, I heard the soft sound of water dripping and then that same quiet breath. I hung up and debated whether to call security or maintenance, but there was no point. The storm had shut down everything, and no one was around to help. I tried to focus on my paperwork, telling myself I was just tired and imagining things. Around 11 p.m., the storm reached its peak. The rain was relentless, and the wind howled through the cracks in the old window frames. The building creaked and moaned, like it was alive and struggling against the weather. Suddenly, the emergency exit door slammed shut with a loud bang. The sound echoed through the empty halls and made me jump. I checked the security camera monitors. No one was outside in the rain. I got up to investigate, opening the door cautiously and peering out into the night. The rain was heavy, sheets of water blurring the streetlights. The sidewalk was empty. I closed the door and locked it again. Back at the desk, I noticed something else. My pen, which I had placed neatly on a notepad, was now lying on the floor beside my chair. I hadn't moved from my seat. I bent down and picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly. A cold draft brushed my neck, and I turned quickly. The lobby was empty and still, except for the steady patter of rain on the windows. I sat down again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move across the far corner of the lobby. I looked up sharply, but there was nothing there. No one. I checked the guest registry again. All guests were accounted for, all doors locked from the inside. My heart started pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just my imagination. But then, as the clock ticked toward midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath became visible in the cold air. I looked toward the hallway that led to the hotel rooms. The dim corridor was empty, but at the end, I could see a faint figure standing near the stairwell door. She was a woman dressed in an old-fashioned white dress, her hair long and dark, hanging loose. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the faint light. I blinked, and she was gone. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I told myself it was a trick of the light or a reflection. I grabbed my flashlight from under the desk and cautiously stepped into the hallway. The beam swept along the walls, but there was no sign of anyone. I moved slowly toward the stairwell, the only exit to the upper floors. The air was icy cold, and I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere above. Suddenly, the stairwell door creaked open by itself. I froze. Gathering every ounce of courage, I pushed it wider and shone the light inside. The stairs were empty, slick with rainwater that had apparently leaked in. I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, but heavy. I spun around. No one. But then the lights in the hallway flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, which blinked weakly before dying. In the blackness, the footsteps came closer. I could hear breathing now, ragged and uneven. A cold hand brushed against my shoulder. I screamed and bolted back toward the lobby. The lights flickered back on as I reached the desk. I locked the door to the stairwell behind me. I sat trembling, my heart racing. The phone rang again. I didn't answer. Eventually, dawn broke and the storm passed. I left the hotel and never returned to that shift again. Months later, I learned that years before, a young woman had died on that very night, caught in the storm, her body found at the bottom of the stairwell. Staff said she sometimes came back, wandering the halls alone during storms, searching for something or someone. I believed them then, and I still do. Story the end. The rain was relentless, drumming against the wide windows of the office building like a constant warning. I had stayed late again, the deadlines piling up faster than I could keep up with. The others had gone hours ago, my coworkers, my manager, even the cleaning crew. The building, a low-slung structure tucked into the edge of the city's industrial zone, was mine alone now, at least for the next few hours. The lights overhead hummed quietly, flickering every so often as if struggling to stay alive against the storm outside. I sat at my desk, fingers numb from typing so long, eyes bleary from the glare of the monitor. The fluorescent lights above flickered a little more insistently as the thunder rolled. The rain masked everything else. The city sounds, footsteps, voices, even the usual hum of the streetlights. The office was a fortress of isolation, but I was used to that. I told myself it was normal, just another night at work, but it wasn't. At around 9:15 p.m., I took a break to stretch. The air smelled cold and damp, even though the heat was on. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the break room's industrial coffee maker and leaned against the counter, staring out the window into the dark alley behind the building. The storm was a curtain of gray, and I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the reach of the weak glow from the parking lot lights. I blinked and it was gone, probably just a trick of the rain and shadows. I carried my coffee back to my desk, but something felt wrong. The office seemed quieter than usual, the silence pressing in from all sides. I tried to focus on the report I was finishing, but the hair on the back of my neck prickled. The first odd thing happened at 9:42 p.m. My computer screen flickered, momentarily going black before the desktop reappeared. I frowned and clicked to reopen the document I'd been working on. The file was gone, not deleted, just vanished. I checked the recycle bin. Nothing. I rebooted the computer, hoping it was just a glitch. The lights flickered again. I heard a faint tapping like fingernail on glass from somewhere behind me. I spun in my chair. No one. Just empty cubicles and the rain streaking down the windows. Trying to keep my nerves steady, I told myself it was just the building settling or the storm making noises. I focused on finishing the work and watching the clock. Around 10 p.m., the lights in the hallway flickered off briefly and then snapped back on, leaving the corridor washed in a sudden, unnatural brightness. I glanced up from my screen toward the dark windows facing the parking lot. For a split second, I thought I saw a face pressed against the glass. Pale, wet hair clinging to a face that looked too long, too gaunt, with eyes that reflected the overhead light like a cat's. I gasped and rubbed my eyes. The face was gone. I tried calling my manager, just to say I was staying late and things were fine, but my phone had no signal. That was odd. The building usually had at least some reception. I stepped closer to the window to try again and felt a chill wash over me, even though I was wearing a thick sweater. Suddenly, my chair scraped backward across the floor. I whipped around, but nothing was there. The tap, tap, tap on the glass started again, steady and slow, like someone knocking. I forced myself to stand and walk cautiously toward the window. The alley was empty, except for slick puddles catching the yellow light from a flickering street lamp. The knocking stopped. I exhaled, shaky. Returning to my desk, I noticed a chat window had popped up on my screen. It was the company's internal messaging system, but the user was unknown to me. No photo, no department, just the name M. The message was brief. "Why are you still here?" My hands trembled as I typed back, "Who is this?" No response. A cold wind swept through the office, even though all the windows were closed. The thermostat read 67 degrees, but the air felt like ice. I wrapped my arms around myself and tried to shake off the unease. Then the lights flickered again, and the office was plunged into near darkness, save for the rain's glow through the windows. My screen went black. The hum of electronics died. Suddenly, the emergency lights kicked on with a dull red glow, casting long shadows. From the darkened hallway came a scraping sound, slow and deliberate, like dragging feet. I froze. The scraping grew louder, closer. I grabbed my phone, still no signal. I backed toward the door, heart pounding. The hallway outside the office door was empty. I stepped out, peering down the corridor. A shadow moved near the end, just beyond the reach of the emergency lights. It was tall and thin, with ragged edges, as if someone wrapped in wet cloth. I called out, voice trembling, "Hello?" No answer. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, the lights flickered back to normal. I gasped. There was no one there. But the air around me grew colder. The hairs on my arms stood up as a low, guttural whisper echoed from the walls, indistinct but filled with sorrow and anger. I stumbled back into my office, slamming the door shut. The whispering followed, growing louder, filling every corner of the room. I grabbed my coat and bag, fumbling with the lock on the door. Before I could turn the knob, the lights went out completely. Silence. Then a cold breath brushed my neck. I didn't wait to see what it was. I flung the door open and ran through the empty building toward the main entrance. The front door was locked. I tried my keycard repeatedly, but it didn't work. Behind me, Footsteps, soft, wet footsteps, paced closer. I turned, heart in my throat. The shadowy figure from before stood at the end of the lobby, face now visible in the dim emergency light. It was the same gaunt, pale face I had seen at the window. Its eyes were hollow, bleeding darkness. It raised a hand and pointed at me. The room grew colder still. I forced myself to swipe my card again. This time, it beeped green and the door unlocked. I ran out into the pouring rain, the cold rain stinging my face as I sprinted toward my car. When I glanced back, the figure was gone, but I could still feel its eyes on me, burning through the downpour. That night, I couldn't sleep. My phone was dead, the chat window frozen on the message, "Why are you still here?" The next day, I told my manager about the messages and the figure, but she just looked worried and told me to take some time off. Curious, I asked the building manager about anyone named M. She hesitated before telling me about a maintenance worker named Mark who died in the building 5 years ago during a storm, trapped in the elevator shaft. They said his spirit sometimes lingered, especially on rainy nights. I never stayed late alone after that. Sometimes when the storm hits, I swear I still hear the tapping on the glass and see those pale eyes watching me from the shadows. Story the end. The rain hammered against the windows in relentless sheets, turning the city streets into rivers. It was the kind of night where the world felt shut away, like everything and everyone was swallowed under a gray, pulsing sky. I was working the late shift alone at the office, the last person left in the building, just me and the hum of fluorescent lights and the constant drumming of the rain outside. The office was a small publishing firm tucked into an old brick building downtown, the kind of place with creaky floors, drafty windows, and a history that wasn't exactly clear but felt heavy in the air. I'd started here a few months ago, working the night audit shift, checking invoices and running reports, tidying up loose ends before the morning crew arrived. Usually, nights weren't too bad. I plugged in my headphones, put on some music, and zoned out to work. But tonight, with the rain pounding so hard, the building felt different, colder, quieter. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the way the light flickered occasionally from the overhead fixtures, casting weird shadows on the walls. I glanced at the clock. 10:15 p.m. Only a few hours left. The front door was locked tight, the reception area empty and dim. The office was mostly on one floor, but there was a basement where the servers and some storage were kept. I'd never been down there alone before, but part of my work involved checking the backup tapes stored in a locked cabinet in the basement. Earlier that day, the IT guy had asked me to pull some files from the backup system down there, but he left before I could do it, and I decided to wait until the quiet of night. The rain made the idea of going into the basement alone feel like a bad choice, but I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. Around 10:30, I got up from my desk, stretching, and grabbed my phone and a flashlight. I unlocked the door leading to the stairwell down to the basement. The old metal stairs creaked under my weight as I descended. The air grew cooler, damper. The light from my phone's flashlight cut through the thick shadows, flickering as if the bulb was dying. When I reached the basement, the room was cramped and smelled like dust and rust. Rows of old filing cabinets and a few racks of servers hummed softly in the background. I made my way to the locked cabinet where the tapes were kept. The lock was old, the key rusty, but it opened with a satisfying click. I pulled out the tape labeled with the date the IT guy had given me. As I turned back, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I stopped, shining the light quickly to the far end of the room. Nothing. I told myself it was just a shadow. I tucked the tape under my arm and headed back up the stairs, careful with each step. When I reached the first floor again, the lights flickered once, then stabilized. I made my way back to my desk, switching on the computer to start loading the backup files. The rain was still relentless outside, water slapping against the window panes with ferocity. Around 11:15, my computer screen suddenly went black. I tapped keys, moved the mouse, but nothing. The monitor stayed dark. I thought maybe a power surge had tripped something. I stood and looked around the room. All the other lights were on. I reached down to check the plug when I heard it, a soft whisper. It was faint, almost lost beneath the pounding rain, but there it was, the unmistakable sound of a voice, speaking a single word. Help. I froze. My breath caught. The word was desperate, trembling. I scanned the room. No one was there. I called out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The whisper came again, this time from the direction of the old storage room near the back. I hesitated, heart pounding in my chest, but my curiosity won out. I grabbed the flashlight and headed toward the door. The storage room door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, the hinges squeaking in the quiet office. Inside, the room was cluttered with boxes and old office equipment covered in dust. I swept the flashlight beam across the room, but no sign of anyone. Then I heard it again, the whisper. "Help me." This time it came from beneath my feet. The storage room had a trapdoor leading down to an even lower crawl space. I hadn't noticed it before. My hands trembled as I pulled it open. The darkness below was thick, and the smell of damp earth rose up. I aimed the flashlight into the void. The beam caught something shiny. A small, broken pendant lay on the crawlspace floor. It looked old, delicate, like a locket. I crouched down and reached for it. The moment my fingers brushed the pendant, a cold gust of wind blew through the storage room, extinguishing the flashlight. I was plunged into darkness. My phone screen lit up as I fumbled for it. The whisper was now all around me, circling, urgent, pleading. "Help me! Help me!" I scrambled out of the crawl space, heart racing, stumbling back to the main office area. As soon as I was back under the ceiling lights, the whispers stopped. The pendant was still in my hand, cold and heavy. I sat back at my desk, breathing hard, trying to calm down. The rain continued to hammer the windows. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched. At midnight, the lights flickered again, and the computer rebooted by itself. The backup files started loading, but I didn't look. I packed up my things and left the office, the pendant in my pocket. On the way home, the rain soaked me through and the city felt empty. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I showed the pendant to my manager. He turned pale and told me a story. Years ago, a woman had worked in this very office. She had been there late one stormy night, just like me. She never came out. They found her the next morning, trapped in the basement crawl space. No one knew how long she'd been there. I dropped the pendant on the desk. I never stayed late alone again. Story the end. The rain had started around 4 in the afternoon. First just a light sprinkle, then quickly building into a relentless downpour that blurred the city outside into a smear of gray and silver. By the time I got to the office for my night shift, the streets were nearly deserted, the sidewalks slick and shiny under the harsh glow of street lamps, struggling against the storm's fury. I worked the late shift at an old municipal office building downtown, a place that once buzzed with workers and visitors, but now mostly stood empty after hours. My job was straightforward: maintain security systems, process a few reports, and keep an eye on the building until the morning crew arrived. Usually it was a quiet gig, and I appreciated the solitude. I liked the stillness, the way the fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, the way the rain sounded against the glass like a distant rhythm. But that night, something felt different. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt heavy, colder than usual. I shrugged it off, blaming the chill on the storm. I flipped on the main lights, which flickered for a second before settling into their steady glow. The lobby was nearly empty, just the front desk, a bank of elevators, and the wide hallway leading to the offices. The polished floor was spotless, but glistened oddly under the lights, like it was still damp. I assumed the cleaning crew had finished early, though no one was scheduled after 3 p.m. I settled behind the security desk in the lobby, plugged in my laptop, and started the nightly checklist. The rain pounded steadily, the storm's intensity making the windows rattle slightly in their frames. Every few minutes, the low rumble of thunder rolled overhead, and I found myself glancing up, feeling a prickle of unease I couldn't quite explain. About an hour in, the power flickered, just a brief dip, but the building's emergency systems kicked in flawlessly. The backup generators hummed to life, and the lights stabilized. Still, the temperature dropped noticeably. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around me and glanced around the empty lobby. That's when I noticed it, a faint tapping noise coming from the elevator bank. Tap, 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 like fingernails rapping softly on metal. I paused my work and listened. The elevators were idle. The digital floor indicators all showed the lobby. No calls were registered. The tapping stopped as abruptly as it began. I chalked it up to the storm and went back to my reports. 30 minutes later, the tapping started again, this time louder and more insistent. It was definitely coming from one of the elevator doors. I walked over and peered inside the shafts through the tiny windows on each elevator car. Nothing moved. When I stepped back, the emergency phone on the wall suddenly crackled to life. The speaker hissed, and I heard a whisper, barely audible, like someone was breathing close to the microphone. I swallowed hard, pressed the button to speak. Hello? Security here. Is someone there? Silence. Then a soft, sorrowful sigh echoed through the speaker. The phone went dead. I set it down uneasily. The storm outside hammered harder against the building. The fluorescent lights above flickered and buzzed. A sharp crack of thunder shook the walls, and I jumped. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut with a force that made the glass panes rattle. I wasn't expecting anyone else in the building, and there was no one else on the cameras. I walked to the door and checked the security system. No one outside. The lobby was empty. I double-locked the door, but the uneasy feeling settled in my gut. I returned to the desk and noticed the office phone ringing. I picked it up quickly. Security. How can I help? Silence, except for that same faint breathing sound, then a whisper. Help me. My heart hammered in my chest. Who is this? I asked. No answer. The line went dead. I sat back down, trying to steady my nerves. I switched over to the elevator camera feeds to see if anyone was near the shaft. One monitor showed the elevator doors opening on the 4th floor, but no one was there. The doors closed slowly on their own. Then, on the 7th floor feed, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing near the hallway wall. Pale, wearing what looked like a long white dress. I blinked and the figure vanished. I rubbed my eyes and replayed the footage. There it was again, a woman, face pale and expressionless, hair dark and hanging loose. I felt the room's temperature drop sharply. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the stairwell to check the upper floors. As I climbed the stairs, the emergency lights flickered and buzzed overhead. The air grew colder with each step. At the 7th floor landing, the hallway was empty, but a cold breeze brushed past me, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and something floral, like old perfume. I called out softly, "Hello?" No answer. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps behind me. I whipped around. Nothing. Only the empty corridor, silent except for the storm's distant roar through the building's ventilation system. I moved forward cautiously, flashlight in hand. Suddenly, the stairwell door slammed shut behind me. I tried the handle. Locked. I pounded on the door, yelling for help. The footsteps approached again, slow and deliberate. I spun around, the flashlight beam catching nothing. My breath was visible in the freezing air. Then the figure appeared before me, the same pale woman in a white dress, her eyes dark and hollow. She reached out, lips moving but no sound came. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The door behind me rattled violently, then clicked unlocked. I bolted down the stairs 2 at a time, burst into the lobby, and locked the door behind me. The lights flickered back to normal. The temperature rose gradually. My hands shook as I called the front desk security line, but the only response was static. The storm outside began to ease. I sat at the desk, unwilling to move. By dawn, the building was quiet again. When the morning staff arrived, I told them what had happened. The supervisor told me the story of a young woman who had died in the stairwell decades ago, a tragic accident during a storm much like this one. She had been a night clerk like me, working alone. Her body was found after the storm passed, just steps from the bottom. They said she sometimes returned during storms, her spirit trapped in the building, searching for someone to help her. I never worked the night shift again, and on rainy nights when the wind howls and the thunder crashes, I still think I can hear the faint tapping and soft breathing from that old building. Story the end. The rain was relentless that evening, drumming against the broad windows of the office building like 1,000 restless fingers tapping a dark rhythm. It had started early in the afternoon, a steady downpour that didn't let up, turning the streets slick and shiny with reflections of street lamps and car headlights. By the time the last of my coworkers had filtered out, the entire office felt swallowed by the storm. I was the only one left, alone at work. I glanced up from my laptop as the clock ticked closer to 8 p.m. My eyes were tired, the glow of the screen harsh against the dim office lighting, but I still had a stack of reports to finish by morning. The office building was an old brick structure, its bones built back in the 1960s and heavily retrofitted over the decades. The windows were big but thick, and on nights like this, the rain pattering against them made everything inside feel distant and detached from the world outside. I pulled my sweater tighter around me and took a sip of cold coffee, the bitter taste doing little to ease my growing fatigue. The storm was thickening now. Thunder rumbled low and far off, the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the dark clouds with a sickly yellow glow. The sound of rain was constant, almost hypnotic, but it wasn't peaceful. There was an edge to it, a persistent tapping that seemed irregular, like something trying to get my attention. I shook my head and returned to my work, telling myself I was just tired. It was just the storm. Around 8:30 p.m., the lights flickered. That faint, familiar flicker that always made the skin on my arms prickle. The overhead fluorescents buzzed and dimmed for a moment before stabilizing again. I sighed, knowing the old wiring in this building was probably going to give me trouble tonight. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the glass door leading to the stairwell. A shadow flitted just beyond the frosted glass panel, tall and slender, standing still for a brief moment before disappearing. I told myself it was a trick of the light, rain sliding down the glass in thick streaks that could easily create illusions. Still, I glanced over to the door a few times after that, feeling a strange pull in my chest. At 9 p.m., I decided to take a break. I got up, stretching cramped muscles, and headed toward the small kitchen area in the back of the office. The break room was dark except for the dull glow of the fridge light, but the rain outside made the windows look like liquid mirrors, hiding anything beyond the glass. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. The silence around me was thick, almost suffocating. I noticed the overhead lights flickered again, more violently this time, before settling. That's when I heard it, the faintest tapping sound, coming from somewhere near the back door. It wasn't the rain. It was rhythmic, slow, deliberate. I froze, coffee cup halfway to my mouth. The tapping came again, louder this time. I swallowed hard and walked cautiously toward the back door, heart thudding. The storm masked nearly all other noises, but the tapping was clear, distinct, like someone knocking. The back door was a heavy metal frame with a small window, and through the streaked glass I could see nothing but the rain pouring down. No one. I stepped closer, pressed my forehead against the cold glass. Still, no one. But then as I pulled back, I caught a glimpse of something. Just for a second. A pale face pressed against the window, eyes wide and unblinking, with wet strands of hair plastered to the skin. I stumbled back with a startled gasp. Blinking, I looked again. Empty. I wanted to believe it was my imagination. The rain, the shadows, the strain of working late. But something about the way the face had been so still, so hauntingly quiet, made my skin crawl. I hurried back to my desk, locking the door behind me. The office felt colder now. The hum of the computers and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights no longer comforted me. They seemed sharper edges cutting through the room. At 9:15 p.m., my computer screen suddenly went black. I froze, fingers hovering above the keyboard. After a moment, the screen flickered back on, but my files had disappeared. The report I'd been working on was gone without a trace. I clicked around frantically, my mind racing. Was this some kind of technical glitch? I rebooted the computer, but when it came back, the files were still missing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was nothing more than a software error. But then my office phone rang. I jumped, staring at the silent device. I glanced at the caller ID. It was blank. I hesitated, then answered. Static crackled on the other end, then a faint whisper, "Why are you still here?" I choked on my breath. "Who is this?" I whispered. No reply. The line went dead. I set the receiver down slowly, heart hammering. My hands shook. I tried calling the front desk, but the line was dead. Even my cell phone refused to get a signal. That's when the temperature dropped sharply. I noticed my breath puffed out in little clouds. The overhead lights flickered again and then dimmed to a dull, reddish glow. The emergency lights kicked on, casting long shadows in the corners. Then the tapping began again. This time, not on the glass, but on my office door. Tap, 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 slow, insistent. I forced myself to stand and move toward the door. The hallway outside was shrouded in red light, empty, but the tapping persisted. I turned the handle, it was locked. I rattled the knob in panic. The tapping turned into scratching. Something was on the other side. My pulse pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. A silence heavier than any I'd known filled the air, then a soft whisper floated through the door's small window, words too faint to make out but filled with sadness. I stumbled backward, heart racing. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I yanked it out. An unknown message on the screen. Don't leave. My legs gave out and I sat down hard. For a moment the storm outside seemed to quiet. Then a slow dragging sound echoed from the stairwell. I looked toward the door, faint shadows shifting in the flickering light. The door handle rattled violently. I scrambled to my feet and backed away. The door burst open suddenly, but no one was there. Just an icy wind that swept through the office, scattering papers and blowing out my coffee cup. My eyes darted around the room, heart in my throat. Then I saw it, movement in the corner. A figure, translucent and pale, with hollow eyes that gleamed with a terrible sadness. It floated silently, a shape dripping with water like it had just stepped from the storm itself. It reached out a hand, fingers long and thin, dripping with rainwater that pooled on the floor. I screamed and ran toward the emergency exit. The figure followed, gliding closer with every step. I fumbled with the door, slamming it open and spilling out into the pouring rain. The cold rain hit my face and soaked my clothes as I sprinted across the parking lot. I glanced back once. The figure stood at the threshold of the building, watching me with those empty eyes. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, rain blurring my vision. The next day, I called the building manager to report the power fluctuations and strange noises. She told me about a worker who had died in the building years ago during a storm like this one, caught in the stairwell while trying to fix a power outage. They never found his body until the next day. They said his spirit sometimes lingered, especially on stormy nights, trapped between worlds. I never stayed late alone again. And whenever the rain falls hard and the storm rumbles low, I still get the feeling I'm being watched. Story the end. The rain had started around dusk, tapping against the wide windows of the office like a steady drumbeat. It was the kind of storm that settled in for the night, soaking the world outside and wrapping everything in cold, damp silence. On the 5th floor of the Wilcox Insurance Building downtown, I sat alone at my desk, trying to finish the end-of-quarter reports that were due by morning. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. My supervisor had offered to let me go early too, but I'd waved her off. I had too much to do, and I figured a few hours of peace and quiet would help me knock everything out without distraction. At first, it was. The office was dark except for my desk lamp and the occasional flicker of lightning across the windows. I had music playing low from my phone, mostly to keep the silence from becoming too oppressive. The HVAC made its usual soft hum, and the city outside was just a ghostly smear of glowing buildings through sheets of rain. Around 9:45, I got up to use the restroom. The lights in the hallway flickered when I walked past them, the motion sensors apparently not quite registering me. It had always done that. I didn't think much of it. But when I came out of the bathroom and turned the corner to head back to my cubicle, I stopped short. One of the chairs at the end of the hallway was turned around. Now, that wouldn't normally be strange, except it hadn't been like that before. I was certain of it. These chairs, cheap ergonomic ones on wheels, were all pushed in neatly under the shared computer desks near the copier room. I had passed them not even 10 minutes ago. I stood there for a moment, staring at the turned chair, wondering if maybe the janitor had come through while I was in the restroom. But there had been no sound, and anyway, janitorial services usually came around midnight. I told myself it was nothing, walked over and pushed the chair back in. It squeaked on the laminate floor as I moved it. Then I heard it, the soft roll of another chair moving somewhere further down the office, just out of sight. I froze. The sound was unmistakable, a faint drag and then a roll, like someone pushing off from a desk, maybe standing up. I waited, listening, but no one came into view. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly small in the cavernous space. Nothing. I waited a moment longer before shaking my head. "Maybe I'm just tired," I muttered. I walked back to my cubicle and sat down, My heart was thumping just a little faster than it had before. I tried to shake the tension off, went back to my spreadsheet, and focused on numbers. It worked for a while, until about half an hour later. The overhead lights, those long, buzzing fluorescents, flickered once, then twice, and then popped off completely, leaving only the dim orange glow from emergency lights and my desk lamp. I looked up, blinking in the sudden darkness. I stood up and walked toward the hallway again, past the empty cubicles, their computers asleep, the printer still. The emergency lights lit up only part of the corridor, throwing everything else into long shadows. As I passed the copier room, I heard something. Breathing. Soft, labored breathing. I stopped, listened. My pulse was hammering in my ears now, but I was sure it wasn't mine. It was coming from the supply room. The door was slightly ajar. I crept forward and reached out slowly to push the door open. No one inside. I scanned the room quickly. Shelves of paper reams, boxes of pens, unopened monitors. Nothing that could make noise. I backed away, shutting the door with a quiet click. Maybe it was in my head. Maybe the storm outside was playing tricks with the pressure in the building or something. I was halfway back to my desk when I saw it again. The same chair, turned around. Only this time it was closer, just 3 cubicles down from mine. I stood there, not breathing. I hadn't heard it move. I hadn't seen anyone walk by. But it was there, undeniably, impossibly, in a different spot. I didn't go to it this time. Instead, I sat at my desk, locked my eyes on my monitor, and tried not to think about it. I started typing again, hands trembling slightly. Numbers, percentages, performance growth, anything but the creeping dread that was building in my chest. Then I heard the sound again. Wheels, slow, soft, getting closer. I didn't turn around. My palms were sweaty on the keyboard now. I sat completely still, waiting. The lights flickered back on for half a second, just enough for me to see a shape reflected in the dark screen of my monitor. Someone standing behind me. Then darkness again. I spun around, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. No one was there. The chair was gone too. I stood up, walked fast to the security office near the elevators. It was supposed to be manned until midnight. The door was open, but the room was empty. Monitors still showed live footage from the various cameras around the building. I scanned them quickly, looking for movement. On one of the screens, I saw the copy room door open slowly, then close. No one entered or left. I hit the intercom button, called the building manager. Nothing but static. I should have left then. I should have taken the elevator down and gone home. But some stupid part of me still thought there had to be a logical explanation. That I was overtired, overstressed, or maybe even falling asleep at my desk without realizing it. I went back to my cubicle and started packing up. That's when I saw the sticky note on my keyboard. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. The paper was yellowed, brittle, the handwriting strange, faint, shaky letters. Don't turn around. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't want to move. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. Then I heard it. That breathing again. Close. Right behind me. And I didn't turn. I stood, keeping my back rigid, and walked straight forward, never once looking back. I went to the stairwell this time. I didn't trust the elevator. The stairwell was dim, the emergency light casting long shadows on every landing. I made it to the second floor before I heard the door above me creak open. I started walking faster. Another door opened. I broke into a run. Footsteps followed. Not heavy ones. Light. Too light. Like something brushing against the stairs rather than walking on them. When I reached the ground floor, I bolted through the lobby and out into the rain. The chill hit me like a wall. But I didn't care. I ran across the street into the parking garage, not stopping until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys and got inside, locked the doors, started the engine, and that's when I saw the chair, sitting in the middle of the garage just 20 feet behind my car, facing away from me. It hadn't been there before. I drove out of there like my life depended on it. I didn't come back to the office for 3 days. I called in sick, blamed the weather. When I did return, I came in only during daylight hours. I finally asked around discreetly about anything strange happening in the building. One of the older employees pulled me aside, said the building used to house a call center back in the late 90s. A man had a breakdown one night, stayed late after everyone else left, locked himself in the copy room, and never came out. They found him 3 days later, just sitting in a chair, staring at the wall. No injuries, no note, nothing. He never spoke again, died 6 months later in a care home. The chair he'd been found in, nobody knew where it went, but sometimes on rainy nights it shows up again, always facing away, always closer than the last time. I haven't worked a single night shift since, and I never sit in the copy room chairs. Story, the end. The rain had been falling steadily all afternoon when I arrived at the office. The sky was a uniform slate gray, and the steady drizzle had turned into a relentless downpour by the time I stepped out of my car. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few late workers and the occasional security guard making rounds. I hated working late alone, but the reports I needed to finalize had a deadline the next morning, and no one else was available to stay. The building itself was old, built in the late 1960s, and had an imposing institutional feel. I'd been working there for almost 3 years, but I never got comfortable with how quiet the place was after hours. The kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like waiting for something to happen. Inside, the air was thick and smelled faintly of damp carpet and stale coffee. I flicked on the overhead lights and started up my computer. The fluorescent bulbs buzzed softly above me. The storm outside was growing worse. Rain pounded against the windows like fingers drumming insistently, the sound amplified by the empty office spaces. Occasionally, distant rumbles of thunder echoed through the city streets. I dove into my work, the hum of the computer fan and the tapping of my keyboard the only sounds accompanying the storm. After about an hour, I realized the building's old electrical system was starting to act up. The lights flickered. The bulbs dimmed, brightened, and flickered again, like a pulse echoing the storm outside. It was unsettling. Suddenly, the power cut out. The room was plunged into darkness. My heart jumped. The only light came from the soft glow of my laptop battery indicator and the faint red emergency lights blinking at the far end of the hall. Outside, the rain intensified, a heavy curtain of water pounding on the windows. The wind howled, making the metal vents above creak ominously. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight app. The beam sliced through the dark, showing the deserted cubicles and scattered papers. The emergency lights cast long, eerie shadows, turning the office into a labyrinth of silhouettes and dark corners. I was alone. I tried calling the front desk, but my phone wouldn't get any signal. The storm must have knocked out cell service, too. I debated whether to try and find the fuse box or wait for the power to come back, but something in the silence felt wrong, almost suffocating. I decided to investigate the hallways anyway. As I made my way toward the main electrical room on the other side of the floor, the flashlight beam danced nervously over the walls, catching posters, signs, and emergency exit maps that seemed suddenly more ominous in the dim light. Then I heard it, a faint tapping noise. It came from the far corner near the stairwell exit. I stopped, heart thumping loud enough to drown out the rain. The tapping was slow and deliberate, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the wall. I called out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer, just the persistent tapping. I approached cautiously, every nerve on edge. The rain thundered outside and the building groaned, the old pipes rattling somewhere beneath my feet. I reached the stairwell door and tried the handle. Locked. But the tapping continued. Then I saw it. A pale handprint pressed against the fogged glass panel of the door. It was smeared as if someone had pushed their palm hard against it, then slid it down slowly. I froze. The handprint was too high to be mine, and there was no one else in sight. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I stepped back, breathing rapidly, my mind scrambling for a logical explanation. Maybe a security guard or a late worker had come down from the upper floors? I knocked on the glass and called out again, but no one responded. The tapping stopped. Silence. I turned away from the door, but that's when I noticed the faintest sound, like whispered voices carried by the ventilation system above. The voices were indecipherable, but urgent, almost pleading. I followed the sound down the hallway toward the old conference room at the end. The door was cracked open, just enough for me to slip inside. Inside, the air was colder. My flashlight flickered briefly as I scanned the room. Old wood-paneled walls, a massive table covered in dust, and on one wall a framed black and white photo of the original employees from the building's opening day decades ago. I noticed a figure in the photo, A young woman standing near the center, her eyes dark and her expression grim. Something about her unsettled me, like she was staring right through me. I looked away and heard the door creak shut behind me. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand. The door was firmly closed. I tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. My breathing grew heavy, panic creeping in. Then, from the shadows near the window, I saw her, a translucent figure, a woman, standing silently, drenched in rain despite being inside the room. Her hair was dark and wet, slicked back against her pale skin. Her eyes were hollow, deep wells of sorrow, and her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. I dropped the flashlight, its beam swinging wildly and casting her ghostly silhouette against the walls. The room temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in quick, visible puffs. I scrambled to the door, pounding on it and yelling, "Let me out! Please!" The ghostly woman took a step forward, her gaze locked on mine. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. The room snapped into normalcy. She vanished. The door clicked open. I ran out, heart hammering, not daring to look back. Outside, the storm was still raging. I sprinted down the hall to the stairwell, slipping and sliding on the wet steps, and finally burst through the lobby doors into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside my car, drenched and shaking. The next day, I learned that the woman in the photo was Margaret Lewis, a secretary who had died tragically in that building in the 1970s during a storm like the one I'd just survived. She had gotten caught in the stairwell fire door that jammed during a blackout, and no one found her until the next morning. People said her spirit lingered, trapped in the building, especially on stormy nights. I never stayed late alone again. But sometimes, when the rain falls hard and the power cuts out, I swear I can still hear tapping on the walls and whispers in the vents. Story the end. The rain was relentless that night, a steady, unyielding torrent that hammered the windows of the old office building where I worked alone. It wasn't uncommon to have the place to myself after 8 p.m., especially on a Thursday. Most people had already left by then, either tired from a long day or eager to get home before the weather worsened. But for me, the night shift was routine, monitoring servers, handling late calls, and making sure everything ran smoothly until morning. The building was old, a relic from the 1950s with peeling paint, creaky floorboards, and narrow hallways dimly lit by fluorescent lights. There was something about the place that felt off sometimes, an atmosphere thick with silence and shadows that stretched too long down empty corridors. But I chalked it up to being old and ignored it most nights. That evening, the rain started just as I arrived. The sky was a heavy slate gray, clouds rolling in low and thick. I had barely settled at my desk when the storm began in earnest, rain thrumming against the windows and thunder rumbling faintly in the distance. I liked storms. They made the world feel alive in a way the bright, sterile daylight never did. The steady rhythm of rain was almost hypnotic. I logged into the system and began my rounds, checking server statuses, making sure no alerts had popped up, and responding to a couple of emails. My phone buzzed once, a client calling about a login issue, but the call dropped quickly. Probably the storm messing with the network. Around 9:30 p.m., the lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. The power was holding steady, for now. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping noise coming from somewhere down the hall. At first, I thought maybe someone was still in the building, maintenance or security. But the tapping was irregular, soft, almost like fingers drumming lightly on a surface. I stood up and strained to listen. The hallway was empty. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and stepped out into the corridor. The lights hummed above me, casting harsh shadows against the walls. The tapping stopped. I walked slowly toward the end of the hall, flashlight beams sweeping over cracked tiles and old, dusty bulletin boards. Nothing. A sudden gust of wind pushed open a door at the far end of the hall. I shined the light inside, a small storage closet, and saw nothing but stacks of cardboard boxes and cleaning supplies. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing unnaturally loud. My heart started to beat faster. I shook it off. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself. Back at my desk, I tried to focus, but the tapping returned. This time, it was coming from the office directly across from mine, a room that hadn't been used in years. The door was closed. I got up again, flashlight in hand, and cautiously approached. As I neared, the tapping stopped. I glanced down at the door handle. It was cold to the touch. I knocked gently. No response. The building groaned, the old pipes creaking as water surged somewhere deep inside the walls. I turned away and went back to my desk, feeling a chill crawl down my spine. At around 11 p.m., the rain intensified, the thunder louder, closer. I could hear the water splashing against the pavement outside, the occasional crack of lightning illuminating the darkened office in brief, stark flashes. The phone rang, shrill and sudden, making me jump. It was the landline on my desk. I glanced at the caller ID. No number, just unknown. I hesitated, but answered. Static, heavy breathing, then a whisper. Leave. Now. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, heart hammering. A prank call? Someone messing with me? I tried calling security, but got no answer. My cell phone had no signal. The lights flickered again, this time more violently. The hum of the computers grew distorted, the monitors flashing strange static patterns. I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the empty hallway. Nothing. But the air was suddenly thick, heavy with cold. The office door creaked open slowly, revealing darkness beyond. I could hear footsteps. Slow, deliberate, but no one was there. I grabbed my coat and keys, moving toward the exit, but the building seemed to stretch endlessly. The hallways twisted and lengthened unnaturally, shadows growing deeper, swallowing the light. My breath fogged in the cold air. The whispers returned, unintelligible but urgent, filling the space around me. Suddenly a figure appeared at the end of the hall, a woman in a soaked dress, hair matted and dripping. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids, and her lips moved silently. I tried to run, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. The figure reached out with pale hands, fingers long and thin like branches. I screamed and bolted toward the stairwell, the sound of wet footsteps chasing me. The rain outside was louder than ever, a chaotic symphony against the building. I burst through the exit doors into the storm, gasping for breath, drenched and shaking. Behind me, the building stood silent, its windows dark and empty. I never went back. Sometimes on rainy nights, I swear I can hear that tapping again, soft and rhythmic, calling me back inside. Story the end. It had been raining since noon, the kind of steady downpour that turned the city into a blur behind a veil of water streaking the windows. I had volunteered to stay late at the office, not because I particularly enjoyed my job, but because I needed the overtime pay. Rent was due, my car needed new tires, and the fridge had been humming its last notes for days. Practical reasons, nothing romantic about it. Our building was one of those older brick monstrosities nestled between two high-rises downtown. It used to be a garment factory decades ago, before the owners gutted the place and converted it into office space. They kept some of the original features for character, the exposed brick walls, the steel beams, even an old freight elevator that only worked when it felt like it. I worked on the 6th floor in a marketing agency, mostly handling digital campaigns and writing client briefs. Nothing glamorous. By 7 p.m., the last of my coworkers had packed up and left. Rachel from finance waved as she left, coat slung over her shoulder, umbrella already unfurling as she opened the glass door. She hesitated just before stepping out and said something like, "Good luck with the ghosts," before laughing and disappearing into the curtain of rain. I smiled, but it was forced. That joke wasn't new. Everyone who worked in the building had heard the stories. Shadows in the stairwell, the elevator going up and down on its own, voices in empty rooms. I'd never experienced anything myself, and I always chalked it up to the building's age and creaky infrastructure. Until that night, I didn't believe in any of it. I stayed focused on my work for another hour or so, typing with the dull rhythm of rain in the background. The office lights cast long reflections on the floor, and the HVAC system hissed quietly overhead. The space was open concept, so it felt even emptier when it was just me. My footsteps echoed any time I got up to grab coffee or stretch my legs. Around 8:30, I heard the first noise, something subtle like a whisper or the dragging of a shoe across carpet. I paused mid-sentence and looked up, eyes scanning the rows of empty desks. Nothing. I went back to typing, but my ears were now tuned to the silence around me. A few minutes later, it came again, this time more distinct, like someone clearing their throat in the distance. I stood up and walked toward the hallway that led to the conference room and the break area. The hallway was dimly lit, and the motion sensors didn't trigger the lights until you were halfway through, leaving the front end in shadow. I called out a tentative hello and waited. No answer. I walked down the hallway, the lights flickering to life as I moved. The break room was empty, as expected. The fridge hummed in the corner. I opened the conference room door and found nothing but neatly arranged chairs and a faint scent of old coffee. I told myself it was probably the pipes or air pressure changes from the storm outside, maybe even the old elevator groaning somewhere below. I went back to my desk and kept working, though my focus was shot. Around 9:15, the lights flickered. Not just in the hallway, but in the main office. Just for a second, then steadied. But in that brief moment, I thought I saw something at the far end of the room, a figure. It was gone by the time the lights came back. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. "Rachel?" I called out, almost laughing at myself. "You forget something?" Silence. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping it over the desks. Nothing moved. But the sense of being watched was immediate and suffocating. My skin prickled, and the hair on my arms stood up. Something was off. Then I heard the elevator. It groaned to life, the ancient pulley system whining as it climbed floors. I hadn't called it. No one else was supposed to be here. I rushed over to the windows that overlooked the shaft, but I couldn't see anything through the wired glass. The elevator stopped on my floor with a heavy clang, and the gate creaked open. I stayed frozen in place, waiting for someone to step out. No one did. The elevator stayed open for a long moment, then the gate slammed shut and it descended again, clattering down the shaft like it had never been used. I thought about leaving. My laptop was still open, and I had 3 more emails to send, but something about the air in the office felt different. Heavier. Denser. I tried to shake it off. Maybe someone on another floor was still here. Maybe maintenance. I didn't want to be the kind of person who spooked themselves over nothing. At 9:45, my screen went black. I cursed and tried to wake it up, but it was dead. Power out. But only to the laptop. The lights were still on. I grabbed the charger, thinking maybe the battery had drained, and checked the outlet. Everything was plugged in. I reached under the desk to make sure the surge protector hadn't tripped. And that's when I heard breathing. Close. Right next to me. I shot up and banged my head on the desk. My flashlight skittered across the floor, spinning a cone of light around the room. No one was there, but I had felt the warmth of breath against my cheek. It wasn't imagined. Now I was done pretending it was nothing. I gathered my stuff with shaking hands and made for the elevator, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to get in that thing now. Not after what it just did. I turned for the stairs. The stairwell was pitch black, the emergency lights hadn't come on, and the switch at the top didn't respond. My phone flashlight barely cut through the gloom. I started down anyway, footsteps careful and quick. On the 4th floor landing, I heard something behind me. A soft footfall. I turned, shining the light up the stairs. Nothing. But then I saw it. Something dark darting across the upper landing. I couldn't make it out. Just the sense of motion and the absolute certainty that it wasn't just me in the stairwell anymore. I bolted the rest of the way down, taking the last few steps 2 at a time, heart racing. When I reached the lobby, I nearly cried. The security desk was empty, which wasn't unusual that late, but the door was locked from the inside. You needed a key card to unlock it after 8 p.m. I dug into my bag and swiped mine, but the reader blinked red. Access denied. I tried again. Same thing. Come on, I whispered, my voice trembling. Then I saw it, on the glass door just at eye level, a smudge, a handprint. But it was on the inside where I stood. It hadn't been there earlier, and it was fresh. I stepped back, staring at it. The print was wide, with long fingers that seemed too long, like they were stretched, deformed. My hand hovered just shy of it, and the air around it felt cold. Suddenly I heard something behind me, a whisper, impossibly close to my ear. "You don't belong here." I spun around, ready to fight or scream, but the lobby was empty. My chest felt like it might explode. I pounded on the glass, hoping someone on the street might see me, but the rain outside was too heavy. The world beyond the glass was a watercolor blur of traffic lights and shadows. I turned and ran for the freight elevator. It was old and unpredictable, but it had a manual override in the back hallway. If I could get to the basement, maybe I could find the maintenance exit. The hallway was darker than the rest of the building, and the old stone floor felt cold under my shoes. The freight elevator door was open, the interior pitch black. I hesitated. Then a figure moved inside. I barely saw it, just a shape, tall and thin, hunched at the back of the elevator. Its eyes, there weren't eyes exactly, just two pits of black that seemed to absorb the light from my phone. It stepped forward, slow, deliberate, dragging something behind it. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and sprinted back toward the office floor. I didn't stop running until I reached my desk. I ducked underneath and stayed there, curled up and trying to slow my breathing. My phone battery was dying, the screen at 3%. I don't remember falling asleep, but at some point, exhaustion must have overtaken the fear. When I woke up, it was morning. The office was bright, quiet, normal. The laptop was still dead, but everything else worked. My keycard let me out of the front door without a problem. The handprint was gone. I didn't talk about it for a long time. But I found out something later. An old janitor who worked in the building back when it was still a factory had died in the freight elevator, crushed between floors during a maintenance run. Some said he used to sleep under desks to stay warm when he didn't have anywhere to go. I don't know what I saw that night, but I never stayed late again. And when it rains now, really rains, I swear I still hear that elevator groaning from 6 floors up, even when I'm home. Story the end. The storm had been building since the late afternoon, creeping up in slow, brooding layers until it finally broke just after sunset. Rain lashed the windows like fingernails dragging across glass, and the wind made eerie, low moaning sounds through the small alley behind the building. I was alone, finishing up the closing shift at the archives department of the county records office. The building itself was old, built sometime in the late 1800s, and originally used as a textile warehouse. It had been repurposed over the years, and now it housed hundreds of thousands of public documents, birth records, death certificates, land deeds, court files, some dating back over a century. Despite some renovations, the interior still retained much of the original brickwork and heavy wooden beams, and the air always carried a faint, musty scent, no matter how much we cleaned. Everyone else had left by 6 p.m. I had offered to stay late to finish digitizing a set of land survey documents. It was monotonous, but it gave me overtime pay, and since I didn't have anywhere to be, I figured, why not? By 8:30, the storm was raging hard. The power flickered once, then came back steady. I checked the emergency lights just in case and went back to scanning. The scanner's rhythmic hum was the only sound besides the storm. I was seated in a windowless room on the second floor, surrounded by tall steel shelves filled with yellowing file boxes. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, and the occasional thunderclap rattled the loose window panes down the hall. I hadn't seen another soul in hours, and yet there was this persistent feeling like I wasn't quite alone. It started small, like a shift in pressure in the room, a faint static like the sensation you get when an old CRT television is on behind you. I paused, took off my headphones, and listened. Nothing but the rain and the occasional groan of the old building settling. I chalked it up to the storm messing with the building's ancient electrical system. But then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, muffled by the thick carpeting, but unmistakable. They came from somewhere beyond the corridor that led to the elevator, slow, unhurried steps. I froze. My first thought was that maybe the cleaning crew had come in early, but I hadn't heard the side door open. I got up and leaned into the hallway, calling out a cautious, "Hello?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. I waited for another moment, then walked toward the corridor. The fluorescent lights above buzzed louder there, like they were straining to stay lit. I peered around the corner toward the elevator bay. Empty. I checked the time. 8:47 p.m. Too early for the cleaners. They usually didn't arrive until after 10. And I was the only one with a key fob to access the upstairs levels after hours. I decided to do a quick walkthrough, just to be sure. I moved slowly down the hallway, checking each office. They were all locked, lights off, chairs neatly tucked under desks. I made my way to the far stairwell, opened the heavy fire door, and flicked on the light. The stairwell echoed with the sound of the storm outside, wind whistling faintly through the walls. No one there. I headed back, feeling more unsettled than before. The building had always been a bit creepy at night, but this was different. I sat down again, trying to shake it off. Back to scanning, back to the low hum of the machine and the tap-tap of my keyboard. Then something moved in my peripheral vision. Just a flicker. A shadow darting between the rows of shelves behind me. I spun around. Nothing. I stood up slowly, now fully alert, heart thudding in my chest. I walked into the rows, scanning left and right. My footsteps sounded far too loud in the silence. My breath clouded slightly in the air. Why was it so cold all of a sudden? I turned the corner to check the far end and stopped cold. One of the file drawers, one I was certain had been closed, was now open halfway. I hadn't touched that section at all tonight. I approached it cautiously. Inside were neatly arranged manila folders, a few of them slightly pulled forward like someone had been leafing through them. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. I closed the drawer and quickly returned to my desk. My rational brain kicked in. Maybe someone from another department had come in before I got here, left it open. Maybe they'd been looking for something and forgot to close it. That's all. That's all it was, and then the lights went out. The room was swallowed in darkness so absolute it felt like it pressed on my skin. The silence was deafening. Even the hum of the scanner had stopped. For a moment I didn't move. I couldn't. I could barely breathe. Then the backup lights kicked on. Dim red emergency bulbs set at intervals along the ceiling. Everything was cast in a hellish crimson glow. That's when I saw her. Down the aisle between the shelves at the far end, a figure, tall, thin, dressed in what looked like a dark gown, standing stock still. Her head was cocked at an unnatural angle, long hair hanging over her face. My mouth went dry. I blinked, took a step back. She didn't move. I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. I turned to run but caught on the edge of a chair, and I stumbled hard to the floor. When I scrambled up and turned back to the aisle, she was gone. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my bag and bolted toward the stairwell. My only thought was to get outside, get to my car, get away. As I threw the stairwell door open, I felt the air shift behind me, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I didn't look. I couldn't. The stairs creaked under my feet as I ran down, every echo magnified by panic. I hit the first floor, pushed open the door, and ran through the lobby toward the exit. The glass doors were fogged from the rain, and for a moment, I couldn't find the key to unlock them. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys. As I bent to pick them up, I caught sight of something in the reflection of the glass, a pale face right behind me. I screamed and turned. Nothing. I fumbled the door open and ran into the rain. Cold, pounding rain soaked me instantly, but I didn't care. I didn't stop running until I was inside my car, locking the doors with trembling fingers. I sat there, gasping, watching the entrance through the foggy windshield. No one came out. The building stood there, stoic and silent against the downpour. I didn't go back in that night. The next morning, I returned with my supervisor to explain what happened. I expected to be laughed at, or at least met with polite skepticism. But instead, she got very quiet. After a moment, she nodded and led me to a locked cabinet near the records room. Inside was a small collection of documents, photos, and notes. She handed me a worn, water-stained folder and told me to read it. It was a report from 1952 detailing the death of a young woman named Eleanor Price. She had worked in the same building back when it was still part of the courthouse. She had been a records clerk, working late alone one rainy night, just like me. Her body was found near the second-floor archive room. No signs of struggle, no injuries, just dead. Her eyes were open, wide open. Whispers had circulated for years about her ghost, about cold spots and voices and flickering lights, but nothing had ever been proven. "You're not the first to see her," my supervisor said quietly, "and you won't be the last." I transferred to another department shortly after. I couldn't stand being alone in that building again, especially not at night. Even now, years later, when the sky turns black and rain begins to fall, I sometimes catch a glimpse in the corner of my eye, a flicker of motion, a shadow in a hallway, and I remember that awful, suffocating silence, that feeling of being watched, and I remember her face. Story the end. The rain came down in sheets, hammering the parking lot behind the office like it had a personal vendetta against the asphalt. I'd stayed late that night, trying to meet a deadline my manager had dumped on me last minute. It was one of those low-rise, two-story office buildings on the edge of town, half empty, since the pandemic when most businesses went remote. Our firm was one of the few still clinging to the old routine. I didn't mind the quiet, it made work easier until nights like that one. The building creaked in the rain, a sound I'd grown used to over time. The old HVAC system kicked on with a low rumble as I sat alone on the second floor in our marketing department. Everyone else had clocked out hours ago. My desk faced a row of glass windows that overlooked the dark alley between our building and a storage warehouse. I could see my car from there, the silver paint dulled under the water-streaked glow of a flickering security lamp. Around 9:40 p.m., I got up to stretch. I was the only one in the whole place. Security didn't patrol our floor anymore after they cut costs, and I'd locked the main door downstairs when the last guy left. I went to the break room for another cup of coffee. The corridor lights were on sensors and flickered on one by one as I walked through the dim hallway. Rain thudded against the windows with dull persistence. I stopped at the break room door. Something felt off. I don't know how else to describe it except to say it felt like walking into a room someone had just left, even though I hadn't seen or heard anyone. The air felt heavier. Still, I shook it off and poured myself a cup. The pot was lukewarm and tasted bitter, but it would do. When I walked back to my desk, I noticed a message notification had popped up on my screen. That caught me off guard. I hadn't gotten an internal message since before dinner. It was from our internal messaging app, just a short message from someone named L. Owens. That wasn't a name I recognized. I clicked it, expecting a mistake or spam. The message read, "Why are you still here?" I stared at it for a second, unsure how to respond. My first instinct was to look up their name in our employee directory. There was no one by that name currently employed at the company. The last Owens I remembered worked in HR, but she'd retired years ago. I typed back, "Still finishing up? Do I know you?" No response. I waited a few minutes, staring at the blinking cursor, then shrugged it off. Maybe it was an old account or some prank. I got back to work, trying to drown out the growing unease curling around my stomach. By 10:15, I heard something strange. Footsteps. They weren't loud, just a slow, steady tap of shoes against the linoleum floor, somewhere down the hall. I froze, hands paused over my keyboard. The office was empty, had been for hours. I listened, not even breathing. They stopped as suddenly as they started. I stood up and walked slowly into the hall, the motion lights flicking on one at a time again as I moved. "Hello?" I called out, voice sounding absurdly loud in the stillness. No answer. I waited another minute, then checked the hallway, peeking into every cubicle. Nothing. The bathrooms were empty. Even the supply room, which always gave me the creeps, was undisturbed. I tried to convince myself I was just jumpy. The rain had turned into a thunderstorm outside, and lightning flashed through the windows, casting warped shadows through the corridor. I went back to my desk, planning to finish up and leave in 20 minutes max. That's when I noticed my computer screen again. Another message. I'm still here, too. No typing indicator, no follow-up, just those 5 words. I stared at the screen, my skin crawling. My hands felt clammy, and I suddenly noticed the temperature had dropped. I checked the thermostat. It now read 62 degrees, even though it was set to 70. The air had a strange chill, like walking into a room with the window left wide open in winter. I typed quickly, "Who is this? This isn't funny." No response. I pulled out my phone to call security, but I had no signal, no bars. I moved to the windows, tried holding it up, but nothing. The rain outside had grown heavier, obscuring everything past the glass into a wet blur. Suddenly, every motion sensor light in the hall blinked on, at once. I spun around. Footsteps again. Closer this time. I grabbed my bag and shut my laptop. I wasn't staying any longer. I hurried down the hallway, shoes squeaking against the wet floor. I hadn't noticed the water before, thin puddles trailing along the hallway like someone had walked in soaking wet. But the entrance downstairs was locked, and the only other way in was the fire escape on the side of the building. When I reached the stairwell, I felt a pulse of cold wind sweep past me, and I swear to God I heard a whisper, just a single syllable right in my ear. "Wait." I bolted down the stairs 2 at a time. The motion lights didn't come on in the stairwell. I fumbled my key card, trying to open the downstairs door. It beeped red twice before finally clicking open. The lobby was darker than it should have been. The emergency lights glowed faintly, and the overhead fluorescence flickered irregularly. I sprinted for the front door, still locked, just like I'd left it. Behind me, I heard a thump, then another. I turned back, scanning the empty reception area. A shape was moving across the hallway behind the glass-walled conference room. At first, it looked like a shadow, but it wasn't cast by anything. It moved independently, slow, almost limping, like it was searching. I ducked behind the receptionist's desk and held my breath. The sound of rain seemed distant now, replaced by the soft echo of whatever it was dragging across the floor. The lights flickered again. It stopped outside the glass. It stood still, and I couldn't make out a face, just the shape of a person, water dripping off their shoulders, their head tilted too far to the side like their neck was broken. They pressed something against the glass. Their hand. It left a smudge that didn't look like a handprint. It looked darker, greasier. Almost as if the glass itself had decayed under their touch. I stayed crouched, counting the seconds, heart pounding. Then the front door buzzed, automatically. No one had touched the security panel, no keycard swipe. It just unlocked on its own. I didn't wait to question it. I ran, through the door, into the storm. I hit the parking lot at full sprint, rain soaking me instantly. My hands shook so badly I could barely get my keys into the car door. As I opened the driver's side, I looked back. The second-floor window above our office was lit. Someone stood there, looking down. Not moving. I stared for only a second, but it was enough. They raised their hand and waved. I didn't even shut the car door before I threw it in reverse and peeled out of the lot. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I came in late. Bright daylight made the building seem less threatening. My coworkers laughed off my story, said maybe I was just stressed. Maybe someone from maintenance was doing a walkthrough. Maybe the storm messed with the lights. But when I checked my computer, the chat from L. Owens was gone. No history. No record of the messages. I'd said the account had been deleted over 5 years ago, belonged to a woman named Laura Owens. She died in the building in her office during a weekend shift. Massive stroke. No one found her for 2 days. Her office, it's now used as the storage closet on our floor. The last thing I did before leaving early that day was walk by the storage room. The door was cracked open. Inside, I saw a damp footprint on the tile. Just one. Story. The end. The rain hadn't stopped for hours. It beat down in sheets, hissing against the windows and drumming the rooftop like the footsteps of someone pacing overhead. I was alone at the office. Again. It wasn't unusual. I worked for a small publishing company in Portland, and since we were on tight deadlines for the next issue of our magazine, I often volunteered to stay late. Most people avoided night shifts in the old building, especially when it rained. They said the place felt wrong when it stormed, like the walls pressed in and the air turned heavy. I never gave it much thought until that night. The office sat on the edge of the city, a 3-story brick building dating back to the 1920s. It had once been a warehouse before being converted into office space. Everything inside creaked. The floors, the walls, even the elevators made long, moaning sounds when in use. By now, I had learned to tune most of it out. I had my usual setup on the second floor, the layout open except for a few glass-partitioned cubicles, dim lamps, and stacks of books and papers from floor to ceiling. It was nearly 9:30 p.m. when I realized I hadn't seen anyone for hours, not even the janitor. I stood, stretched, and walked to the break room for another cup of coffee. That's when I first noticed it. From the hallway, I could see the break room light was off, but the coffee pot was brewing. I hadn't turned it on. I hadn't even stepped foot in there since lunch. As I stepped closer, the smell hit me. Burnt coffee, sharp and acrid. I reached for the light switch and froze. I swear, just before I flipped it on, I saw someone standing by the counter, unmoving in the dark. But when the lights came on, there was no one there. The coffee pot was half full, the warmer on. I stood there for a long moment, listening. Nothing but rain on the windows and the distant echo of my own breath. I turned off the warmer, dumped the pot, and decided I was just tired. My eyes were probably playing tricks on me. Back at my desk, I tried to focus on editing, but something was off. Every few minutes, I'd hear a creak nearby. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps just outside the cubicle, sometimes like a knock on the far wall. I told myself it was just the wind the storm shaking the old bones of the building. Still, I started checking over my shoulder every few minutes. At 10:12 p.m., the lights flickered. It wasn't unusual. Old building, storm outside, wires probably not in great shape. But then my monitor shut off completely. Not just the screen, everything powered down, including the overhead lights. I waited a second. Backup lights usually kicked in within 10 seconds. I counted to 15. Nothing. In total darkness, I sat still, barely breathing. The rain was louder now. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, switching on the flashlight. Its narrow beam lit only a sliver of space in front of me, but it was enough to see the edges of the cubicle walls. I got up slowly and made my way to the breaker room at the end of the hall. The office was silent except for the faint creaks underfoot and the rain slamming against the windows. My footsteps echoed strangely, like there were more than just mine. At the breaker box, I flipped the main switches back and forth. Still nothing. As I stood there wondering what to do next, I caught something in my peripheral vision, movement in the far end of the hallway. I spun around, shining the flashlight down the corridor. Nothing. But as I stared, I felt it, an odd pressure in the air, like someone was watching me from just around the corner. I called out, "Hello? Is someone else here?" No answer. I took a few slow steps down the hall, the beam of light jittering slightly in my unsteady hand. As I reached the main reception area, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. It wasn't like the building getting cold, it was like walking into a freezer. My breath fogged in front of me. That's when I heard the elevator ding. I whipped around. The elevator was at the far end of the hall. It hadn't been used in hours. I watched as the doors slowly creaked open. No one inside. I waited, not daring to move. A second passed. Then the doors began to close again. Just as they did, I saw it. A figure standing in the far corner of the elevator, pale, with something dark dripping from its face. The doors shut before I could get a full look. I backed up until I bumped into the reception desk. I wasn't alone. I ran. Back to my cubicle, grabbing my bag and coat, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't care about finishing the article anymore. I just wanted out. When I reached the stairs, I hesitated. I didn't want to take the elevator. No way. But the stairwell was pitch black, and the light on my phone was getting dim. I didn't even care at that point. I opened the door to the stairwell and stepped inside. It was worse than I expected. The air in there was thick and stagnant, and the walls seemed closer together than they should have been. I began descending the steps quickly, trying not to let my mind wander, but then I heard it behind me. A footstep, just one. I stopped. It was followed by another, slow, deliberate, coming from above. I ran, nearly tripping over my own feet as I descended to the first floor. When I burst through the stairwell door, I found myself in the lobby. The front doors were locked. It was a safety measure the building enforced after hours. I had to unlock them manually. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The lock finally clicked. Just as I opened the door to step outside into the rain, I saw the reflection in the glass. Standing just behind me, almost shoulder to shoulder, was a woman. Her face was wrong, too long. Hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed stretched wide as if she were mid-scream, but no sound came out. I ran into the rain, not stopping until I got to my car 2 blocks away. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I came in late and found a few of my coworkers huddled near the break room, talking in hushed voices. The power had returned sometime after midnight, but the cameras had gone out around the same time I left. No footage of what I saw. No way to prove it. One of them mentioned something odd, though, how every time it rained, people on the second floor reported strange things. Shadows. Movement. The smell of burnt coffee. They said the building used to be a textile factory, but back in the 40s there had been a fire. A woman had been trapped on the second floor. No one ever found her body. She was last seen near the break room. I stopped working late shifts after that. If I had to stay past dark, I made sure someone else was with me. I never went into the stairwell again, and I avoided the elevator at all costs. But every time it rains, I remember that night. The smell of burnt coffee, the face in the glass, and how close she had been. Story the end. Under the dim overhead light of the warehouse break room, I sat with my coffee growing cold beside me and my rain-damp jacket hanging off the back of the chair. Outside, the rain hammered the metal roof with relentless force, the sound filling the vast emptiness of the building, like static on a dead channel. It was nearing midnight, and I was the only one left in the building. I worked inventory at a distribution warehouse just outside the city limits, one of those gray monoliths that stretched for blocks and always smelled faintly like damp cardboard and dust. Our regular shifts ran during the day, but once a month, someone had to stay overnight to audit the monthly stock count. This month, it was my turn. I didn't mind at first. I liked being alone, especially in a place that normally buzzed with forklifts and loud conversations. At night, the place became cavernous and silent, with only the occasional groan of settling steel beams or the muffled roar of rain to keep me company. The only issue was the light, rows of long overheads that seemed to flicker whenever I passed under them, as though they had to think about staying on. By 10:30, I'd made it halfway through the main inventory section. Aisle after aisle of towering metal shelves, crates stacked floor to ceiling, barcode scanner in one hand and clipboard in the other. I kept my Bluetooth earbuds in for company, a podcast about unsolved mysteries droning on in my ears while I checked item codes and counted boxes. Around 11 Han, I took a break in the tiny upstairs office to warm up and jot down some numbers. The office overlooked the warehouse floor through a big, grimy window. The lights below buzzed weakly, casting sickly pale light over the maze of pallets and shelves. I remember pausing to glance out and thinking how eerie it all looked from up there, like staring down at a deserted city made entirely of boxes. Then I noticed something strange. One of the motion sensor lights down by the east wing flicked on. No big deal, those lights were overly sensitive sometimes, but it caught my attention because I hadn't been down that way for at least an hour. I leaned forward slightly, watching. Another light, a few shelves down, blinked on. Then another. They lit up in sequence, one after the other, leading away into the deeper, darker part of the warehouse. I watched, waiting for an animal or a person to appear, but no one did. I got up, shrugged my jacket back on, and went downstairs. Maybe it was a bird that got trapped inside. It wouldn't have been the first time. When I reached the floor, everything looked normal again. The motion lights were off. I walked to the aisle where I'd seen them light up and stood there, listening. Nothing but the soft thrum of rain and the faint creak of high shelves settling in the temperature drop. I went back to my work, deciding I was probably just tired. The rest of the inventory check went fine for another half hour until I heard what sounded like a box falling. It came from the far back corner of the warehouse, near where we stored items that didn't get moved often. Seasonal decorations, old promotional materials, things like that. I stopped and listened. Silence returned quickly, but I was sure I'd heard something heavy drop and thud onto the concrete floor. I grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the noise. When I turned into the final aisle, I saw it. A single cardboard box was sitting in the center of the corridor, halfway open, contents spilled. Paper banners and fake pine wreaths. I looked up at the shelves. There were no empty spots where something could have fallen from. The shelves were solid, and the box didn't even look crushed. It looked like it had been carried there, or dragged. I bent down and picked up the box. As I did, I saw something move at the edge of my vision. I turned fast. Nothing. The aisle behind me was still and empty, but something about it felt wrong, like the air had gotten heavier. I dropped the box back onto a shelf and walked quickly away. The further I got from that corner, the more normal things felt. By the time I reached the main walkway again, I was telling myself it was nothing. The box must have been perched badly and slipped. I went back up to the office to write down my notes and finish the shift. That's when I noticed the smell. It hit me as soon as I opened the office door, faint but sharp, like old water and mold. The air inside felt thicker, slightly damp, even though the windows were sealed. I walked in cautiously, looking around, and then I saw it. On the glass of the window overlooking the warehouse floor, a message was scrawled, not in marker or paint. It was written in condensation. "Why are you still here?" I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The condensation hadn't been there earlier. The office was climate controlled. I reached out and touched the window. It was dry. No actual moisture. I stepped back, staring. My breath came in short bursts now. I wiped the message off with my sleeve, grabbed my things, and decided the rest of the count could wait. On my way down the stairs, I passed one of the cameras. I hesitated. We had a security feed stored in a little server closet near the entrance. Just to be sure, I went in and queued up the last few hours of footage from the office camera. There it was, me walking in and out, sitting at the desk, and then something else. Around 11:53 p.m., the camera caught the glass window fogging slightly like a breath had passed across it. And slowly, over about 10 seconds, the message appeared. No hand, no pen, just the words slowly forming. Then a shadow, behind me, tall, unmoving, standing just inside the door. I felt sick. I fast-forwarded the footage, nothing else. The shadow just disappeared at some point. I couldn't see exactly when. I shut the footage off and walked toward the exit. Except the warehouse was dark again. Not pitch black, just the emergency lights now. I checked the breaker in the office. Everything was still on. The regular lights had just turned off. I pulled out my phone to call someone, my supervisor, or even just a friend, but I had no signal, not even one bar. I moved toward the center of the building, trying to find better reception. That's when the power cut out completely. I stood frozen, the rain outside suddenly sounding deafening as the building plunged into darkness. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path through the pitch. Then I heard footsteps. Soft, slow. On the concrete floor. I called out again. "Who's there?" No answer. The steps got closer. I backed up slowly, flashlight held out in front of me like a weapon. Then the beam caught something, a shape standing still at the end of the aisle, not facing me, just standing, a figure, human, barefoot, wearing something loose and dark, almost like hospital scrubs. The flashlight flickered. I stepped back. The figure didn't move. Then, without sound, it turned to face me. I didn't see eyes or a face, just a gaping hole where the face should be. The flashlight died. I ran, tripping, nearly slamming into the metal shelves as I bolted through the aisles in pitch black. I made it to the break room door and slammed it shut behind me, turning the lock. Inside, I flipped on the emergency lantern we kept for blackouts. The room filled with weak yellow light. Then I saw it. The chair across from me, the one where I'd sat drinking coffee earlier, was pulled out, and someone was sitting in it, or something. Its body was soaked, water dripping from it onto the floor, clothes clinging. A pale hand rested on the table, swollen and grayish, like it had been submerged too long. Its head lifted slowly, no eyes, just skin stretched tight over a skull. It smiled, though there was no mouth, and leaned forward. I opened the break room door and ran again, out into the main hall and through the emergency exit. The rain drenched me instantly, cold, pounding. But I didn't stop running until I reached my car. The building behind me stood silent, no lights, no movement. I sat in my car, soaked, shivering, until the sun came up. I told the manager I got sick that night and couldn't finish the count. I didn't explain further. He let it go. A few weeks later, I heard from one of the other overnight auditors. He said he'd seen something strange too. Boxes falling for no reason, lights shutting off, a voice whispering near his ear though no one else was around. He quit not long after. I stayed another 3 months, but I never took another overnight shift again. I couldn't stand the rain. Not after that. Story the end. The storm had been building all afternoon, a low grumble in the distance that slowly turned into a steady growl by the time I clocked into the night shift. I worked the closing shift at a small office building on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a 3-story structure that housed a handful of local businesses. The company I worked for provided overnight support for client systems, mostly server maintenance, troubleshooting, and responding to emergency emails. It was boring, solitary work. Just me, the hum of machines, and a pot of coffee that never tasted quite right. By the time I took my seat on the 3rd floor, the rain had started, slashing sideways against the windows with that particular violence storms only seem to reserve for rural areas. Lightning lit up the gray beyond the windows every few minutes, and the power flickered enough to make me wish I'd brought a flashlight. I was the only one in the building that night. It wasn't unusual. The other offices on the 1st and 2nd floors closed up by 6, and even my own team was reduced to a single overnight worker to cut costs. It was around 9:30 p.m. when I first noticed the sound. At first, I assumed it was just the building creaking, old HVAC, storm outside, probably nothing. But the sound kept coming back, repeating in a deliberate rhythm that didn't match the chaos of the weather. It was like a slow drag of something across the floor, not heavy, but intentional. I paused my typing and listened. The sound came again. A slow, muffled scrape, like someone dragging their fingers along the drywall just outside the office I was in. I stood up, heart beginning to thump harder, and stepped out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Everything looked the same. The hallway was empty, the doors closed. I even checked the stairwell at the end of the corridor. Locked, just like it should be after hours. I went back to my office and tried to shake it off. Probably the building settling or some trick of the storm outside. Rain can make things sound weird. I convinced myself of that and got back to work. The scrape came again, closer this time. It was right outside the office door. I stopped breathing. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I stared at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Nothing did. No handle movement, no knock, just that eerie sound, then silence. I slowly stood up again, more hesitant this time, and walked to the door. I opened it quickly, like ripping off a bandage. The hallway was empty. I left the office door open and stood there for a moment, trying to hear if the sound would return. All I got was thunder and the constant patter of rain against the glass. Back at my desk, I started a new email when the lights flickered again, this time staying off for a full 3 seconds before the emergency power kicked in, bathing the room in a sickly orange glow. The computers were still online, running on the backup generators, but the rest of the building went dead quiet. That's when I heard the footsteps. They weren't hurried. They weren't loud, just the steady tap of dress shoes on tile coming from the stairwell I had just checked. I turned to face the hallway again. The sound was unmistakable now. Someone was walking slowly, methodically, down the third-floor corridor. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, and stared out into the dim hallway. The light from my office spilled into the hall, but it wasn't enough to see much past 10 feet. I could hear the footsteps, though. So clear, so deliberate. They stopped just before reaching my office. I grabbed the heavy metal flashlight from my desk drawer. It was standard issue emergency gear, the kind that could double as a weapon if needed. I stepped out into the hallway and raised the light, clicking it on. The beam cut through the orange haze, landing on nothing. No one was there. I swept the light up and down the hallway. I was still alone. I called out, "Hello? Who's there?" No answer. I moved cautiously down the corridor toward the stairwell. Every step echoed far more than it should have. When I got to the door, I pushed it open. The stairwell was pitch black, no emergency lights here, just thick, humid darkness. I swept the flashlight beam down the stairs. Nothing moved. No one was there. That should have been it. That should have been the moment I walked back to my desk, grabbed my stuff, and left for the night. Screw the job. But I didn't. I stood there like an idiot, staring into the blackness, waiting for something I couldn't explain. Then I felt it. A cold rush of air, unnatural and bone deep, blew up from the stairwell, freezing my skin. The kind of cold that doesn't belong in a sealed building, not in June, not when the AC was off due to the power. Then came the whisper. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like the idea of words, something just beneath hearing, spoken in a voice that sounded too close to be from below. I slammed the stairwell door and bolted it. Then I ran back to my office and shut that door too. I didn't want to hear another sound from that hallway, but of course the building had other plans. The phone on my desk rang, the old landline that never rang unless it was internal. I stared at it, heart hammering in my throat. The screen displayed a 4-digit extension I didn't recognize. I picked it up. Static, then faint breathing. Wet, ragged breathing, as if someone was holding the phone inches from their face, exhaling slowly. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice firm. More breathing. Then the line went dead. I sat there unsure of what to do next. Then the printer in the hallway outside started up. It whirred to life and began printing page after page. I opened the door slowly and peered out. The corridor was bathed in orange again, and at the end of it, the communal printer was churning out paper like mad. I approached, flashlight in one hand, the other ready to run. The printer had spit out over a dozen pages. I picked one up. It was a photocopy of a face, pale, hollow eyes, open mouth. The image was smudged like it had been scanned from a wrinkled, damaged photo. The face didn't look alive. It looked stretched. as though it had been pulled into a scream that had never stopped. Each page was the same face, some darker than others, all distorted. I dropped the stack and backed away slowly. The hallway lights flickered again, and for a second I saw something reflected in the window at the far end of the corridor. A shape, thin, unnaturally tall, standing just out of frame. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing. I went back to the office and shut the door, locking it this time. The rest of the night passed in a kind of suspended terror. I didn't leave my chair. I didn't make another sound. I sat there with the flashlight on, the landline unplugged, and the printer silent again. Around 3:30 a.m., the power returned in full. The lights blinked back on, humming with fluorescent normalcy. The rain was still going, softer now, but steady. I stayed until 6 a.m., until the sun rose and the sky turned from black to a dull gray. When my replacement came in, I didn't say a word. I just nodded, grabbed my bag, and left. I told myself I'd quit the next day. I never wanted to step foot in that building again. But curiosity gets the better of people, doesn't it? That night I did some digging. I searched the building's history. Turns out the structure had been rebuilt in the late 90s after a fire. The top floor used to be a psychiatric office. One of the patients had died in there. Suicide, they said. He'd left behind dozens of pages of drawings, mostly faces, all screaming. I didn't go back to work after that. I quit over email. A week later, I got a manila envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside were 10 pages, copies like the ones from the printer. Same face, same dead eyes. No explanation. I burned them. Every now and then, especially during storms, I think I hear that dragging sound again. In the walls, in the wind, in the whisper of paper sliding from a printer tray. And sometimes when the lights flicker, I see the face again, burned into the shadows behind my eyes. Waiting. Story. The end. The rain had been relentless all day, soaking the city in sheets of gray, muffling the usual sounds of traffic and people outside. By the time the office started to clear out, the sky was black, and the downpour was louder than the quiet conversations and goodbye murmurs of my coworkers. One by one, they left, umbrellas snapping open and wet footsteps trailing away until it was just me on the 5th floor of the old building downtown. I was used to staying late. I worked in a small insurance office, mostly filing claims and following up with clients on accident reports. Not exactly exciting work, but it paid the bills, and I was good at it. My boss, Mr. Langley, was the type who noticed things, so I stayed behind to finish the backlog from earlier in the week. Everyone else had slipped out before the storm got worse. I didn't mind, or at least I didn't think I did at first. The building was old, built sometime in the 1930s, and it creaked and moaned whenever it rained. The windows rattled, and the heating system made strange, hollow coughing sounds. I'd gotten used to it after working there for nearly a year. Still, there was something about being alone that night that felt different. Not necessarily bad, just off. I sat at my desk in the center of the open plan office, fluorescent lights humming faintly above me. The rain hammered against the windows in waves. Every now and then, a gust of wind would hit the glass and shake the frames. I typed quickly, eager to get through the last few reports. I didn't want to be there any longer than I had to be. It started with the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the building, or maybe the rain shifting something loose on the roof, but the steps were distinct, measured and slow, like someone walking across the linoleum hallway just beyond the reception area. I stopped typing and listened. The steps paused too. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. After a few seconds, I shook my head and turned back to my screen. Probably just my imagination. Or maybe someone had come back for something they forgot. Then I heard it again, closer this time. The steps moved from the hallway into the tiled break room area, where the floor changed from carpet to cheap vinyl. The difference in sound was clear. And that time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice catching slightly. No response. I stood up and walked toward the break room, peering around the corner. The lights were still on, and everything looked exactly as it should. The coffee pot sat half full, a few mugs left unwashed in the sink, the microwave clock blinking 12, like always. But no one was there. I stood still for a minute, waiting, listening, still nothing. I turned to go back to my desk, and that's when I saw the elevator display. It was an old-fashioned one, with a red digital readout showing the floor number. It was glowing 3. Then it changed to 4, then 5. It stopped. I waited for the chime, waited for the doors to open. They didn't. I stepped toward it cautiously, watching. Nothing moved. The elevator just sat there, silent, like it had delivered someone who never left. I took a deep breath and walked back to my desk, forcing myself to refocus. Maybe it was a glitch. The elevators in the building were ancient, and the rain had knocked out power more than once. I looked at the screen and started typing again. A few minutes passed, and then I heard a door slam. Not the wind, not some distant sound echoing from outside. A definite slam, sharp and angry, from inside the office. My chair scraped the floor as I stood. I scanned the space around me. All the offices lining the outer wall had glass windows. I could see they were empty. But one door stood ajar now, the records room at the far end. I walked toward it slowly, my shoes squeaking slightly on the carpet. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The lights inside the room were off. They were always left on. I pushed the door open slowly. The air inside was cold, colder than the rest of the office, enough to make me shiver. I reached in to flick the switch. Nothing happened. The lights stayed off. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight. Rows of filing cabinets stretched out in front of me. The place looked undisturbed, nothing out of order except for one drawer. One drawer was pulled open all the way, and hanging out of it, loosely clutched by the metal handle, was a single manila folder. I walked toward it, hesitated, then pulled the folder free. There was no label on it. I opened it, expecting old forms or accident reports. Instead, there was a single sheet of yellowed paper inside. Typed, not printed. I read the first line, and my skin prickled. If you are reading this, it's already too late. The rest of the message was cryptic. Something about how the building held on to things, how it remembered, how it didn't like to be forgotten. At the bottom was a name, Wesley Sharp. I didn't recognize it. No one by that name worked in the office. I put the folder back in the drawer and shut it quickly. The room suddenly felt unbearable, like the air had thickened around me. I backed out and shut the door behind me, then locked it with a key from the front desk. I returned to my computer and went online to search the name. There it was. Wesley Sharp, age 28, office assistant. Died in the building in 1997, electrical fire on the 5th floor. Trapped alone during a thunderstorm. Same floor, same weather, same eerie timing. The article said the fire department found his body near the records room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Just then, all the lights in the office flickered. Once, twice. Then went out completely. I sat frozen in darkness, only my phone screen offering any light. Outside, the rain pounded harder, almost drowning out the sound of my own heartbeat. Then I heard breathing. Close. Too close, right behind me. I turned, shining the flashlight into the shadows. Nothing. But I could still hear it. A rasping, shallow breath that didn't belong to me. I stood, backing away slowly, keeping the light steady. I turned toward the elevator. The number display was off. Everything was dark. Suddenly, from behind me, a loud crash. I whipped around. The records room door was open again. Even though I had locked it, I didn't go back. I didn't want to see what had come through. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the stairs, not even caring about the 5 flights down. I could hear footsteps above me as I ran. Slow, heavy, dragging. I burst through the lobby door and into the rain without even grabbing my coat. I didn't look back. The next morning, when I told Mr. Langley what happened, he just gave me a strange look. He said the records room hadn't been used in years. Everything in there was supposed to be boxed and sent off-site. I asked him about Wesley Sharp. He paused, said, "You must have seen an old article. We've had other employees find stuff about him. Weird how it keeps turning up." I asked what he meant, and he said this, with an odd smile. "You're not the first to stay late during a storm, but most don't come back the next day." I quit a week later, found another job across town, but I still think about that folder, that name, the footsteps in the dark, the way the lights died, and the breath I heard behind me. I wonder who else has heard it. I wonder if someone will find that folder again. I never told anyone everything. I didn't need to. Because sometimes, late at night when it rains hard and the sky goes dark, I dream of that office. And in the dream, I'm not alone. Story, the end. The rain started falling just as I was locking up the main entrance to the office building. It was early evening, around 6:15 p.m., but dark clouds had rolled in so thick that it already felt like night. Outside, the steady drumming of rain against the pavement and the rhythmic tapping of water sliding off the metal awning above the front door created a relentless soundtrack, the kind of weather that seemed to suck the warmth and light right out of everything. I was alone at work, again. Most of my coworkers had left hours ago. It was the end of the week and the office had been slow. My boss asked me to stay late to finalize some reports for a client deadline the next day. The usual. I didn't mind. Overtime was always welcome, and the quiet helped me focus. Plus, I liked the rain. It felt calming, even if it made the old building groan more than usual. The office was on the third floor of a commercial building that had been around since the late 1950s. Nothing fancy. Plain cubicles, beige walls, fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, and the occasional rattling vent overhead. The building had that old, slightly musty smell you get from decades of paper files, carpet glue, and dust. It creaked and settled with every gust of wind. I was used to it. Most nights, the sounds blended into white noise, but tonight was different. After an hour or so, I noticed that the lights started flickering, just barely at first. I glanced up and frowned. A small storm warning had been issued that morning, so flickering wasn't unexpected, but this was persistent. The lights dimmed and brightened every few seconds like they were struggling to stay on. I decided to ignore it and kept typing on my keyboard, eyes scanning the screen. The rain outside intensified. Through the window, I could see the dark streets slick with water, puddles reflecting the occasional flash of lightning. The office clock ticked steadily, but the flickering lights made it hard to focus. Suddenly, the overhead lights all went out. Complete darkness. For a second, I froze, startled. The hum of the HVAC system cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of the rain. My breathing got heavier, the pounding in my chest echoing louder in the sudden quiet. I reached for my phone on the desk, flicked on the flashlight, and scanned the room. The beam revealed empty desks, papers scattered here and there, and the dim outline of my cubicle walls. The emergency exit lights kicked on a soft red glow, faint but steady. At least I wasn't completely blind. I stood and made my way cautiously toward the break room at the far end of the floor, hoping to find a flashlight or maybe a portable radio. The office was eerily silent, except for the rain thrumming against the windows. My footsteps echoed strangely in the darkness. The break room light switch was dead. I pressed it repeatedly, but nothing. The microwave, coffee maker, and refrigerator all sat quiet and dark. I leaned against the counter, my heart still racing, trying to steady my breath. Then I heard it, the faint sound of music. It wasn't coming from a radio or a phone. The sound was faint, like a soft, scratchy tune playing on a record player, a slow, mournful melody, vaguely familiar but distant, as if muffled behind a thick wall. I spun around, flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The music stopped. I blinked. My mind was playing tricks. Maybe the wind outside had carried the sound from a nearby building. I told myself to calm down. The power outage had probably affected the entire block. I walked back toward my cubicle, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. The emergency lights cast long shadows that warped and shifted with every move. It was impossible to ignore the sensation that something else was there with me, watching from the darkness. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from my boss. "Power's out at the building across the street too. They're working on it. Shouldn't be long." I exhaled slowly and tried to refocus. I had work to finish. Back at my desk, I pulled out a small LED lamp I kept for camping. Its harsh, white light cut through the gloom and made the room feel less oppressive. I turned it on and set it beside my keyboard. Typing resumed, but my eyes kept darting to the window. Outside, the rain hadn't let up. Cars passed by slowly, their headlights flickering through the sheets of water. Streetlights blinked sporadically, struggling against the storm. The whole neighborhood seemed trapped in a haze. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught something moving. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a swaying tree branch. But the movement was too deliberate, too controlled. I turned my head slowly toward the window. There, just outside the building, standing under the awning, was a figure. At least, I thought it was a figure. It was tall and thin, dressed in something dark and shapeless. The rain made it hard to see clearly, but I could make out the outline of a person, or something like a person. They stood perfectly still, just watching, not moving an inch. My heart jumped into my throat. I blinked, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. Maybe I had imagined it. The storm and power outage were playing tricks on me. I tried to focus on work again. Minutes later, the emergency lights flickered, then dimmed even further. I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, somewhere down the hallway behind me. I froze. The sound was distinct, heavy shoes on the linoleum floor. No one else was supposed to be here. I was alone. I turned around slowly, shining my flashlight toward the hall. Nothing. Just empty walls and closed office doors. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was the janitor, maybe checking other floors, but it didn't sound like the janitor I knew. His steps were always quick, almost nervous. These were measured, purposeful. I sat back down, but the feeling of being watched only deepened. The computer suddenly blinked on by itself, the monitor flickering to life. A new email notification appeared. Subject: "You shouldn't be here." I stared at the screen, frozen. There was no sender, no message content, just that subject line. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't dare reply. I hit delete and the screen went black again. My breathing was fast and shallow now. I grabbed my phone again, intending to call my boss, but it slipped from my trembling hands, clattering onto the floor. The screen cracked slightly as it hit the linoleum. I cursed under my breath, feeling more helpless than ever. Then, from the other side of the room, a soft whisper: "Leave." It wasn't my imagination. It was real. The voice was low, raspy, and close, like someone standing right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just shadows stretching in the dim red light. My flashlight flickered violently. I dropped it. Darkness swallowed the room. A cold chill wrapped around me like ice water. I felt a breath on my neck, a whisper again: "Leave now." I bolted for the stairwell door, fumbling with the lock. The rain outside was louder than ever, hammering the building like it wanted in. I burst through the door and raced down the steps two at a time. The stairwell smelled of damp concrete and mildew, the walls stained with water damage. The emergency light there flickered on and off, threatening to go out completely. I reached the first floor lobby and tried the front door handle. Locked. I checked the side exit. Also locked. Panic rising, I pulled out my phone and tried to call 911, but the screen was dead. I was trapped. The building groaned around me, settling with the storm. Behind me, the faint sound of footsteps on the upper stairs. Slower this time. Deliberate. Closer. I backed into the corner, heart pounding, breath fogging in the cold air. Suddenly, the lights in the lobby flickered on. For a split second, I saw her, a woman, wet hair plastered to her pale face, dark eyes wide and empty, her lips parted in a silent scream, and then she vanished. The lights died again. I ran toward the main door, trying every key on my ring. The door clicked open. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted into the rain, soaked to the bone in seconds, not daring to look back. I never returned to that office alone on a rainy night. Weeks later, when the power was restored, a coworker told me about the building's history. During the 1950s, a young secretary named Margaret worked late one stormy night, just like me. She was found the next morning, drowned in the stairwell, trapped by a fire escape door that had malfunctioned. Some said she never left the building. Sometimes on rainy nights, people still hear her footsteps and see a pale figure standing by the windows. And every so often, a strange email with no sender or content shows up on the company server. I keep my phone off during storms now, because I never want to hear her whisper again. Story the end. The rain started just as I was leaving the train station that evening. The sky already bruised purple and gray, thick clouds rumbling with distant thunder. It was one of those days where the weather seemed to swallow everything whole, the steady downpour turning streets into shimmering mirrors reflecting the flicker of street lamps. I pulled my coat tighter around me and jogged to the parking lot. My car was parked near the far end, under the flickering light of a faulty street lamp. The whole lot was nearly empty, just the few usual late shift workers like me scattered about. I worked overnight tech support for a medium-sized company that handled software for several local businesses. My job was mostly uneventful: monitor the servers, respond to system alerts, and take calls from clients who were often half asleep and barely coherent. The building was old, an old converted factory from the early 1900s, and it had that kind of cold industrial vibe with exposed brick walls, tall ceilings, and pipes snaking along the walls and ceiling like veins. The main floor was mostly deserted by 7 p.m., except for the cleaning crew, who usually left by 9. After that, I was alone. I clocked in just before 7:30 p.m. The receptionist gave me a tired smile as she locked the front doors behind me. "Storm's getting worse," she said. "Yeah," I replied, checking my phone for the weather update. The forecast had predicted thunderstorms, but nothing too serious. I wasn't worried. Once inside, I took the stairs to the 3rd floor, where the IT department had its small office and the server room. I settled in at my desk, the familiar hum of the computers buzzing around me like a low drone. The rain hammered against the windows now, and the thunder rattled the glass. I poured myself a lukewarm cup of coffee and logged into the monitoring system. For the first few hours, everything was quiet. I answered a few emails, restarted a couple of frozen programs, and checked the servers regularly. Around 10 p.m., the power flickered once, but stayed on, thanks to the backup generator that kicked in smoothly. Then I heard it. A soft thudding, like footsteps, but slow, deliberate, and heavy. I looked up from my screen, but the office was empty, silent, except for the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. I told myself it was probably the old building settling, or maybe the cleaning crew still somewhere on the lower floors. The footsteps came again, closer this time. I stood up and peered down the hallway. It was deserted, but the light was dim and flickering, and I could swear I saw a shadow at the far end near the stairwell. My heart thumped a little harder. I grabbed my flashlight from the drawer and cautiously walked toward the stairwell door. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No answer. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, shining the flashlight down the dark stairs. No one, just the smell of damp concrete and old dust. I closed the door behind me and locked it. Back at my desk, I tried to focus on work, but I kept hearing the footsteps, sometimes from the hall, sometimes just outside my door. It was as if someone was pacing, circling the area, but I never saw anyone. I called the security desk twice. No one reported any issues, and the cameras showed no movement on my floor after 9 p.m. Around midnight, the storm worsened. Lightning flashes illuminated the room briefly, revealing the eerie, empty space around me. That's when the phone rang. It was the landline on my desk, rarely used and only for emergency calls. I answered hesitantly. Nothing but heavy breathing. Then a whispered voice, barely audible over the static, said, "Get out!" The line went dead. I sat frozen for a moment, heart pounding. I looked around the office, every shadow suddenly seeming deeper, darker. The rain's pounding seemed to intensify, hammering against the windows like someone trying to break in. I tried calling security again, but got no response. My cell phone signal was weak, the storm messing with the reception. The footsteps started again, closer this time. I spun around, shining the flashlight down the hallway. For a moment, I saw a figure, a tall silhouette, blurred and wavering like smoke, standing just outside the stairwell door. I blinked, and it was gone. I locked my office door and tried to steady my breath. The flashlight flickered once, twice, and then died, leaving me in the dim emergency lighting. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. Then the walls seemed to breathe. The old pipes groaned and shrieked, echoing through the building like distant screams. The temperature dropped sharply, frost forming on the window edges despite the summer rain outside. I wrapped my arms around myself, my eyes darting to the stairwell door. Slowly, I heard a scraping sound, like nails dragged across concrete, coming from behind it. I wanted to leave, but I was frozen in place. Then the whispers returned, swirling around the room in a chorus of unintelligible voices. Some seemed angry, others sad, but all full of pain. The air felt thick, heavy, almost suffocating. I grabbed my phone from the desk, hoping for a signal, and dialed 911. The line was dead. Panic surged. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but my voice seemed swallowed by the walls. Suddenly, the stairwell door creaked open, slowly, inch by inch, revealing a blackness deeper than the night outside. From the darkness came a faint, cold breath against my face. I stumbled back, tripping over a chair, my flashlight rolling away, plunging me into near-complete darkness. In that moment, I saw it. A face at the edge of the darkness, pale and gaunt, eyes hollow and black as pitch. Its mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. It hovered there, motionless, as if waiting for something. I scrambled to my feet and bolted to the emergency exit. The stairwell was slick with rainwater seeping in through a broken window. I slid down several steps, but kept going, desperate to get out. Outside, the rain was still falling hard, thunder crashing overhead. I ran to my car, soaked and shaking, the cold biting through my clothes. When I finally started the engine and drove away, I looked back at the building. For a split second, in the upper floor window, I saw that same pale face staring out at me. The next day, I called my boss and told him I wasn't coming back. I never did. Weeks later, when the storm finally cleared, some maintenance workers went into the building and found the stairwell window shattered and strange scratches on the walls, like long fingernails gouging deep into the concrete. They said the security cameras caught nothing but static on the third floor during the stormy night. I never spoke about what I saw to anyone else, but I still get chills when it rains. Story the end. The rain started as a soft drizzle just before sunset, tapping gently against the large windows of the office building where I worked. By the time the last few stragglers left and the streets grew empty, the drizzle had become a relentless downpour, turning the city into a blur of reflections and gray shadows. The steady sound of rain had a calming effect at first, but as the evening deepened, the atmosphere in the building changed. The lights seemed dimmer, the silence heavier. I was alone on the top floor, working late on a report that was due first thing the next morning. The office was usually buzzing with people until around 6, but tonight everyone had left early, eager to avoid the worsening weather. The storm had caused a few delays and cancellations, so my manager had insisted I stay behind and finish what I could. The building was old, built decades ago, with narrow hallways, flickering fluorescent lights, and a faint musty smell that clung to the walls. The rain hammered against the windows, and every now and then a distant rumble of thunder vibrated through the floorboards. The hum of the air conditioning was the only other sound, steady and dull until it wasn't. As I typed away, I noticed the temperature drop sharply. My breath fogged slightly in front of me, an odd sensation in a building that was supposed to be heated and insulated. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around my shoulders and glanced around. The office was empty, except for me, the long rows of desks stretching out like silent sentinels in the dim light. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not the light shuffle of a coworker returning from the break room, but heavy, slow footsteps, deliberate and echoing through the hallway just outside my office. The sound was distinct enough to make me pause mid-sentence, my fingers hovering above the keyboard. I called out hello, but the hallway remained empty. I stood up and pushed the door open, stepping out into the corridor. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced and twisted with every blink. I looked both ways. No one in sight. The footsteps stopped. I shrugged and went back to my desk, convincing myself it was the building settling or the storm playing tricks on my ears. After all, it was an old place. Things creaked and groaned all the time. Minutes passed, and I tried to focus on the report, but a creeping sense of unease settled in. The rain's rhythmic pounding seemed louder now, oppressive. I glanced at the window and noticed a figure standing outside, just beyond the glass, drenched and motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. Heart pounding, I looked around. No one else was in the building. The parking lot below was nearly empty, save for one car. The figure hadn't returned. I told myself it was a trick of the light or a shadow cast by a street lamp struggling against the storm. Back at my desk, the power suddenly flickered, then went out. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the emergency lights casting a faint red glow over everything. The hum of the computers died, and the silence felt suffocating. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight app, the weak beam cutting through the gloom. I decided to check the fuse box in the hallway to see if I could reset the breakers. The hallway was long and narrow, the walls lined with peeling paint and old bulletin boards. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud. I reached the fuse box, opened it, and flipped the main switch. The light sputtered back on, but not fully. Half the bulbs remained dark. I sighed and turned to head back when I saw it again. A shadow, flickering just beyond the far end of the hall. Frozen, I watched as the shape took form, faint at first, then more distinct. A man, soaked from the rain, dressed in outdated clothing, standing completely still. The flickering lights made his features hard to discern, but his eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim emergency lighting. I swallowed hard and took a step back. Who, who are you? I stammered, voice trembling. He didn't respond. The lights flickered again, and when they stabilized, he was gone. I ran back to my office, locked the door, and tried to steady my breathing. Maybe I'd been working too hard, or the storm had messed with my mind. I forced myself to sit and finish the report, but every time I looked away from the screen, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, shadows shifting, whispering just out of hearing. Then the phone rang. Startled, I jumped and looked at the receiver. No caller ID. I hesitated, then answered. Silence. I held the phone to my ear, waiting. A faint sound came through, a low, ragged, bragged breath, then a whisper, so quiet I barely caught it. Help me. I dropped the receiver. It clattered onto the desk. My hands shook. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, but the storm had intensified. The rain hammered the windows like fists, and the roads were slick and dangerous. I locked my office door again and called the security desk. No answer. I called the front desk. No answer. The building was eerily silent, save for the rain and the occasional distant thunder. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding, trying to rationalize everything. Maybe it was a prank, maybe a wiring issue, maybe I was losing it. Then suddenly, the lights went out completely. The emergency lights flickered and died. I was in total darkness. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. That's when I saw the figure again, standing right in front of me. I could see the wet strands of hair plastered to his face, the hollow eyes staring straight into mine. He raised a pale hand, trembling, reaching out. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The room grew cold, so cold I could see my breath. I felt paralyzed, clearer this time, whispered, trapped, alone. The rain outside seemed to drown out everything else. Then he vanished. I bolted from my chair, running through the dark office, fumbling with the door. As I reached the exit, the rain drenched me instantly. I looked back once. The fifth-floor windows were dark. No sign of the figure. I never returned to that office at night again. Months later, I learned the building had a history. A worker had died there decades ago, trapped during a storm. No one could rescue him in time. Some said his spirit still wandered, alone at work, waiting for help that never came. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know the rain brought him out. And sometimes when I hear a sudden silence in the storm, I swear I can still hear the footsteps and the whisper of a trapped soul. Story the end. The rain had been falling steadily since mid-afternoon, turning the streets slick and the sky a uniform slate gray. I was driving out to the old printing press building on the edge of town, where I'd recently taken a night shift job doing security. The building was an aging brick warehouse, a hulking relic from decades ago when it had been one of the biggest employers around. Now, it sat mostly unused, except for a handful of workers during the day and me at night, watching over the place when everyone else had gone home. The company wanted someone overnight to make sure no one broke in or vandalized the place. It wasn't exactly thrilling work, but the pay was decent for something so easy. I was to patrol the grounds, monitor the security cameras, and report anything unusual. Most nights were dull, with nothing more than the occasional stray cat or raccoon scurrying through the shadows. That night, however, things quickly turned strange. The rain hammered down harder as I pulled into the parking lot. Puddles reflected the harsh glow of the few street lamps that still worked, distorting their light into wavering pools of orange. I grabbed my coat and flashlight, stepped out, and made my way to the main entrance. The wind pushed rain sideways, soaking me through almost immediately. Inside, the building was cool and smelled of mildew and old paper. The main floor was vast and empty, the machines long gone or dismantled. The walls echoed every footstep. I switched on the security system and took my first lap. The lights flickered sporadically, and the old wiring hummed with a tired buzz. As I walked, I kept checking the security monitors, the black and white cameras covering every hallway and loading dock. They showed nothing unusual, just empty corridors slick with dampness. Around midnight, I made my way up to the second floor, the offices. Most of the windows here were cracked or broken, letting in cold drafts. I moved cautiously, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was rain on a metal roof panel, but the tapping didn't match the rhythm of the storm outside. It was deliberate, slow, almost like someone knocking. I stopped in the middle of the hallway, heart picking up pace. The sound seemed to come from the far end near the storage closet. I moved toward it, feeling the weight of silence pressing down, heavier than before. The closet door was closed. The tapping stopped as I approached. I hesitated. Something about the stillness was unnatural. Then, slowly, the door creaked open by itself. A gust of cold air spilled out, smelling faintly of damp wood and something else, something metallic. I shined my flashlight inside. The closet was empty except for old cleaning supplies and stacked boxes. No sign of anyone. I blinked, lowered the light, but then the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I jumped and spun around, banging on the door, yelling for someone to open it. Nothing. Just the sound of rain pounding outside and my own breath, quick and shallow. I pulled at the handle, locked. No way in or out. My phone was dead. No signal. Panic started to creep in. I tried the flashlight again. It flickered and died. I was plunged into pitch darkness. I heard footsteps outside the door. Soft, deliberate. A low whisper followed, unintelligible at first, but then it formed into words. "Why are you here?" I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding, unable to see anything. The footsteps circled the door. I tried to steady my voice. "Who's there? Let me out." Silence. Then a soft, eerie laugh. The door handle rattled as if someone was trying to unlock it from outside, but no one came in. Minutes passed like hours. I sat on the cold floor, shivering, until finally the door creaked open just a crack. I scrambled out and didn't look back. I ran down the stairs, rain-soaked and shaking, until I reached my car. I never went back to that job after that night. The next day, when I told the manager what happened, he looked at me strangely, then told me the building had a history. Years ago, a night security guard had died there in a fire. They'd never found his body. Some said his spirit still haunted the building, especially on rainy nights. I believe them now. Story, the end.